Job interviews, career and life advice from just about everybody. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Job Interviews podcast. I am Mike Barrett, and my brother is here as well. Say hello, Patrick.
Hello. I was going to say hello, Patrick, to be super funny.
I was hoping you would.
I am Patrick. Yeah. Carry on.
Whatever. Anyway, so I never know how to start these episodes, which I think is super clear by now.
You may not realize this,
right.
but I never know how to start these. Hi, it's that same thing again. I'm the same guy, and I'm with the same other guy. Yes. Here are some words before I say the words that are new. Yeah. Allow me to offer to you these words. All right, Mike, start the new words now.
Right. So anyway, what I wanted to say is that we're always, of course, like very excited to do every interview that we do, but this one has a special meaning for me because I have known our interview guest for a very long time. Like, I was not as long as I can remember knowing anyone, because obviously I remember knowing people before I went to college, which is where I met our next guest. But like, I don't know how to describe this. When you reach my advanced age, there's just sort of like a category of people that you've known for a very long time.
You physically start to crumble. Yeah, you knew them since before you were like an adult, sort of.
Right.
Feels like a long time ago. And
yes, Shirin is an educator, an educational administrator. Is that the word? She has worked in the administrative sides of education. There's a lot of things with the word education in them. Right. She's been a consultant, classroom teacher, a counselor, college admissions counselor. Sorry, not a college admissions counselor, like in the sense of working in an admissions office at a college, but in the sense of being a counselor who helped counsel people about how to apply to colleges. So yes, has done a ton of things in the field of education and really just has a ton of insight. She's one of those people who is very good at observing and analyzing what goes on around her and drawing non-obvious conclusions. She's also super modest and self-effacing. So
yeah.
I'm imagining her listening to this and being embarrassed that I'm going on so at length about.
But she's not here to stop you. Like
she's not. Exactly.
Yeah.
And anyway, and the thing is, like, we don't even really know most of the good stuff she's done because we only hear the good stuff she's done from her, and we know that she's reluctant to talk about it.
So who knows what she's really
right?
Done.
Who knows what she's actually?
We got to interview her coworkers and
right.
About the whole story.
But anyway, yes, Shirin has a ton of insight to share about just how education interacts with the real world or doesn't in some cases, what goes into being an educator, and all of that, of course, is separate from her own very interesting path into the field of education. She is not someone who set out to be a teacher when she first went to college or anything like that. I don't want to give away the whole story, you'll hear it in a minute, but she's another very interesting example of someone who kind of found a calling which ended up being a very, very good fit, but was not at all the calling that they thought they were going to start out with. And in fact, I think if you had asked Shirin when she was a year or two into college, hey, what do you think of being a teacher? As she makes quick reference to in this interview, she would have been like, I don't want to do that. But she has gone on to build a very successful career there. And I want to point out, when we talk about an educator being successful, obviously we could be talking about like the accolades and the awards and stuff that they receive and the various projects they get to work on, all those kinds of things. But where I think she would measure her success, where I would measure it most of all, is in the number of lives that she has clearly affected in a very positive way. And that's really something. So anytime that you can, listen to what someone with that rich experience has to say, you should. And here she comes. Patrick, do you have anything to say? I've just sort of been...
You've said it all twice, I think. So, I second everything that you said. That all has my stamp of approval.
Well.
And on that note, I think we should...
Maybe we should start writing these intros down before we say them.
Yeah. We'll keep doing this.
Why not? So anyway, yes, the end. Bye.
Most students' career paths will include college, and most students who apply to college will plan to take the SAT or the ACT. Our test prep materials teach the most efficient and effective ways to answer real test questions correctly and consistently. Find out more by searching for the SAT Prep Black Book 2nd edition and the ACT Prep Black Book 2nd edition on Amazon.com.
Here we are with Shirin Foroudi. Shirin, thank you so much for sitting here with us, or sitting virtually at the same time as we're all sitting, looking at the same set of screens. Can you please start out by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me at my house. So I live in Dallas, Texas. I have been here for about 6 years. I am a mom. I have been an educator I was trying to remember the years, but I think it's 19 now. And I've worked in lots of different places in different capacities. So I worked in New York City at a couple different places, and then when I moved here, I've worked in a couple different places. And right now I'm in between transitioning to my next thing. So yeah, that's me.
What is the job that you're heading into in your transitioning?
Yeah, so I'm moving into working at a nonprofit that does some education consulting. They work nationally, and I've done a little part-time work with them through a chunk of the pandemic and really enjoyed the work that I was doing with the people that I was doing it with. And so when an opportunity opened up, I applied, and I was lucky to get an offer. So I start that.
Can you go into a little more detail about what exactly the company does?
Yeah, so they get contracts with either individual school sites, school districts, or the state as a whole to help support them in different ways. One of the ways is in developing a teacher talent pipeline so that there are more teachers of color in public schools. Another way is that they support the restart of whatever this post-pandemic world may or may not look like. And they do other long-term projects with their clients. So working on what English education looks like in the state of whatever, or what career and technical education looks like, and that kind of thing. So they're just kind of an outside organization that can thought partner and consult with their clients. So it's cool. I worked over the last few months with an urban farming charter school in New England on their Restart program, right? I was like, this is great. I've been gardening. But they were in the hybrid space, and they were looking for some support.
When you say hybrid space, sorry, what you mean?
Oh, yeah. So sorry. So hybrid in that some of their students were remote, some of their students were in person. And there was just an article in the New York Times today about if you ask 13,000 school districts how they did teaching during the pandemic, you'd get 13,000 different answers, which is both accurate and incredibly frustrating because it's all of us were going through the same thing at a lot of the same times. And for people to not talk to each other was really weird. But I think to that end, the place that I'm going to work for next does sort of umbrella projects together, and that people are working on different contracts allows for them to have a lens that maybe they couldn't otherwise because everybody else is in their little silos in their schools or districts. So, yeah.
So when you talk about working with these schools and these districts, are you developing curricula or figuring out strategies for hiring, or, what, in more detail, if you wake up and it's day 6 of this project, who are you talking to? What are you doing? What's the kind of the day-to-day details of some of these kinds of?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to what I did so far because I don't yet.
Yeah, obviously I know it's new and everything, but yeah.
So I was working with a couple of the school leadership folks, and we sort of gathered data about what was going on, how remote learning and how the hybrid model was working for them so far. And then in the middle of that attempt to gather data, everybody went remote. So then we, pivoted and said, okay, how's remote learning going? And got the perspectives from the students, from the teachers, and from families. And then looked at that with the folks who were on the leadership team there and figured out that a shared sort of opportunity was really engaging kids, because you both have young children. My darling child has figured out how to like fast forward through the assignments that are asynchronously linked. He's figured out how to click all the buttons at all the right times to make it look like he's doing things. And so,
which is arguably a more important skill.
I was going to say that'll carry you pretty far in life.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's like, yes, that is a set of skills.
Right. No, but it's not
a set of skills.
We also want to cover the other
Right.
things.
It's not what you want, obviously. Yeah.
So I mean, and high schoolers, for better or worse, had that figured out far sooner. And so there was this feeling that the main idea, the crux of what we worked on was how do we get students more engaged and talking to each other? Because one of the things we found out in the surveys were that kids were almost never talking to one another when they were learning virtually. And for me, the value of school was always like the social interaction and knowing how to work with other people. And that was lost, which makes sense because it was kind of like lost. Now my kid gets to talk with all of his friends and I'm like, oh my God, make it stop. Put everyone on mute because it's so loud. But when they're in high school, like if you're a senior in high school and this is the only senior year in high school you're going to get and you don't get to talk to your friends during class, like that's a loss. So we worked on how to make sure that the classes offered real content and real opportunity for the kids to interact with one another and the content.
For that, are the solutions that you're coming up with, are they more looking for new types of technology that allow that sort of interaction, or are they more based on giving teachers strategies and tools and things to allow the existing technology to facilitate that kind of interaction?
It depends. So with this school, they were very fluent in the different technologies. So it wasn't a function of here's what you could use to do this. It was a function of how can we build in the time to allow for this, because it helps kids make meaning. Whereas at my sort of full-time role at a traditional public school district here in Dallas, it was really teaching the technology and supporting the teachers in understanding like breakout rooms and ways to check for understanding using these technologies. So that was a little different, but everybody's at a different place in their comfort with doing this virtually. But it's the kids. The kids are the ones who are totally fine with doing this virtually. They are fluent. They are like digital natives. It's the adults that need to catch up with them in different ways. So
that is really interesting. This is going to make me sound pretty naive, but before we started attending like education conferences and trying to get into just the field a little bit, as observers, I always just kind of thought that the teachers showed up to school when I did as a kid, and then they taught us while I was there in the building. And then when I went home, they went home.
Yeah, I think that makes pretty
yeah, like it never occurred to me that there's like a whole profession. There's like an art. There's there's you guys are like thinking about this when the kids are not around. I know how silly that sounds now, obviously.
Yeah.
But, all of the things that you just mentioned a moment ago about, the different projects and developing talent pipelines and that kind of thing. Yeah, that's all obviously like very removed almost from actually like how do you teach someone calculus? How do you teach someone physics? And I guess, I never realized that kind of thing had to be thought about. Obviously it does though. And how did you, if I remember right, I believe you started as an English teacher, I think, in a high school
did,
program.
yeah.
Is that right?
So when I
did you, sorry. I just wanted to ask, how did you start from there and end up in these kinds of, not like in the classroom sort of, positions, but in the kinds of positions that you're in? If you could just describe that whole arc and yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if it's an arc so much as like a really windy path.
Okay. Describe that aimless ramble, pointless wandering through academia.
Exactly. Now we're closer to it. Yeah. So when I started in education, before education, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. So I did the sort of very typical child of an immigrant. I had two paths. You can be a doctor or a lawyer. So when I was tutoring Michael in the basement of a church in Southeast DC.
Michael, like my brother, or a separate Michael?
No, different Michael, not your
I was
brother.
going to say, I don't remember
I was
that.
like, this is not what I expected. All right, so there's more than one Michael, apparently. It wasn't him.
This was after I had met your brother Michael in,
Gotcha. Okay.
at college. But so I was in DC and I was tutoring him in Spanish, and I realized this was like, I really enjoy this. And it's really nice to help someone. It was the one class he hadn't been passing up until that point, and it was going to get between him and graduation. And so I don't remember who or how I got connected with the opportunity to tutor him, but that coincided with my friend at the time, and she's still my friend today, Maria, who was in the New York City Teaching Fellows. And that program was very similar to TFA in that it meant that
TFA being Teach for America.
Oh, Teach for America.
Okay.
Yeah. In that it was New York City specific, but it really appealed to second career folks or it's an alternative certification to be able to teach in a New York City public school. And it offered some, support and guidance and development and stuff like that in order to do that effectively. So when I was tutoring Michael, not your brother, and I was talking on a regular basis with my friend Maria, who had just moved to New York, the two things kind of like talk to each other in my interest in this other thing. At the same time, my absolute exhaustion with all things related to working at a law firm as a paralegal happened at the same time. And so then I wanted to try teaching. So I applied to that program. When I got in, I lived on Maria's couch for a little bit, then my brother's couch for a little bit. I sort of figured that out. But I was a high school English teacher at Walton High School in the South Bronx. And I lived in walking distance to the high school, and I lived in walking distance to Lehman College, where I was getting my master's for the alternative certification. And kids have always taught me more than I've ever taught them. Like it's kind of it's an unfair deal on their end. But especially that first year, and it was wild, but I loved it, which was also very wild and confusing. So I did that for a while. And then
when you say wild,
yeah, I know. Can we go back to wild?
I have a variety of thoughts as to what that might mean.
No,
yeah.
not, it was wild in like sort of weird things. So I had a mentor teacher who was assigned to me, and unlike what you imagined, Mike, of teachers showing up moments before you did and leaving and waving goodbye and going to a place.
No, in my mind, they didn't go to a place. They just stopped existing.
We just left at school. Yeah.
Right. And then just sort of spawn again in the building when I need you to be
sounding
there.
more naive by the minute.
Right.
If only we could like potion ourselves into it. Yeah. So I would stay after school, and like for every one assignment I would give, I mean, if I was lucky, I would receive roughly 100 back from all the different kids I taught. And then I was like, oh shoot, now I have a stack of things that I have. When am I supposed to do? So I would be at school like constantly. And I would often just stay there until my classes at Lehman, where I could walk to, which was like 6 or 7 at night. And my mentor teacher, one of the things that struck me as wild at the time was was like, oh, you need to leave here. You can't stay. And I mean, to this day, I have no idea how this person was able to grade all the things, plan all the things, call all the parents, do all the things we were asked to do, and leave anytime before 6 o'clock every day. But it was that with things like I was promoted to the English department chair by the end of my first year. Why that happened, I have no idea. There was no reason. No one should have promoted me at that point. It was like only when I got the job did I realize like, oh, that had to be like a short straw situation.
Yeah. Oh, now I get it. Yeah. Maybe if I put enough time in, they'll let me not be the English department chair.
Yeah, it was really, and so that in those ways, it was wild.
Gotcha.
You know, I was sort of pointed at by the math department chair or the math assistant principal or something. And he was starting his own school. He was starting a small school in a bigger school. And that was kind of the trend in New York City at the time.
Wait, a small school in a bigger school?
Yes. So the big comprehensive high schools in New York City sort of were thought of as like too big and not personalized. And they didn't have sort of the community that I think that a lot of people wanted.
Yeah, I think if you have never spent any period of time in New York City or with anyone who has spent a lot of time there, it's hard to grasp how just shockingly huge and complex it is as a city. Like it's more complex in a lot of ways, I feel like, than the whole state that we currently live in, like just in terms of all the programs and everything. I just wanted to throw that in there. So a city, I'm sorry, not a school within a school. Can you explain? Sorry, I interrupted you.
So no, that's fine. So to your point, like, you know, some of the schools in New York City might have 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 kids. And so while that offers a lot of activities and things like that, because you have enough of a population to field for all of those different things, what it doesn't offer is personalization and like a sense of community. So if kids are absent, there's a good chance teachers won't notice that they're absent as much because it's just too big and there's too many kids and all that stuff. So smaller schools became kind of a movement. And it wasn't that the bigger schools became smaller schools. It was more so that smaller schools were housed in the larger school buildings. And the sort of over time, they became more appealing for people to enroll in. So at the school, the founding school where I was at, we started in one building and then we moved over to a different building. It was the same core as a school, but it was just housed in a different location. And it grew to be a pretty big, small school. Which,
a medium school, if you will.
Like a nesting doll situation. A school's so big you could keep another school inside of it.
So, of course, then we had to make another small school in the small school.
Yes. The rest
what else could we do?
Nesting doll situation.
Right.
Yeah. But like weird things happen when you do that, right? Because then you start. So then I started to learn things about helping lead a small school, like the entire school schedule at these schools revolve around two things: the use of the cafeteria and the use of the gym. So your gym schedule and your lunch schedule were dictated by the larger campus needs and all of that stuff. So you had kids who would be eating lunch, you know, air quotes, at 9:15 a.m., for example. And it's like, they have to be in school until like 3:30. So they're eating like breakfast-ish and then whatever. And then gym, which is a requirement and all of this stuff. So I started sort of understanding a little bit more of like the pieces that go into a puzzle that make up a school. And I was, again, for reasons, I should not have been the only founding teacher. I mean, I worked with somebody else, but we were the two founding English teachers. And so we were designing the entire curricula for 9th through 12th. I was like 22. I was like, what? Wow. I do not know why I was in this role. But it meant that I started paying attention to things like, when do kids take the state tests, and can we get them to take AP exams, and what does that mean in terms of where they are now to get them to where they could be, and that kind of stuff. So that opened my eyes, and every sort of professional step that I took zoomed me out a little bit more.
So at this moment, when you're 22 and you and this other teacher are putting all this stuff together, what kinds of resources, whether they were people, publications, websites, whatever, what did you consult to figure out how to do this? Or did it come out of your own head? And who taught you how to do that, if anybody?
No one teaches anyone the things that everyone needs, right? Like, no one.
You know, if we could, I'm hoping the sound guy can clip out you saying that, because that's like the tagline for the whole podcast. Like no one is explaining the stuff that needs explaining. So sorry, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So the New York City Teaching Fellows offers a cohort model where you're in a group of other people being first year teachers at the same time. And there was our teacher, oh my gosh, whose last name I don't remember, but his first name's Colum. And I bumped into him virtually in the last 6 months. He happened to be, and I was like, oh my gosh. So he would lead us, and we would sort of debrief what was going on in our schools. And he would talk to us about classroom management or some of the basic things. But our group started joking that the answer to literally every question we would ever ask him was, it depends. It depends. It depends. And I was like, that is not only adorable, it's infuriating. Like, who is going to talk? So, and one of the other things that was happening side by side was I was in this master's program, presumably to make me some sort of educated educator.
A master.
And the very first class was technology and education. I did not have access to any functioning technology in my first job. So I was in this class learning how to, I guess, run a computer lab or something. Like, I didn't even know what the design of this class. I was like, what are we doing here? So we would all just kind of sit there and stare at each other. And we were taking this class in a computer lab. So like the giant behemoth computer. And we're all like looking up at this professor, and we're looking at each other because none of us are working in places that had technology. Like, what are you talking about? So finally she said something about like, oh, your principals are going to ask you for this in your lesson plan. And I don't think I was the person, but I definitely was like eternally grateful for the person who raised their hand and said, how do you write a lesson plan? And she threw like the whole thing out. She was like, oh, okay, let's start with that. And I was like, yay, we're going to learn the thing I need to learn, because I have no idea what I'm doing. Because especially with teaching, people are like, well, you've been in school.
You get it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could.
Yeah.
Anything in terms of being able to teach, and especially if you went to a school in a very different community, if you went to a school with a different angle, if you like, all of those things matter. So it's a weird assumption that people make. It's like, oh, you've gotten surgery. Surely you can do this surgery. Yeah, right. Like, it's the only career where I feel like that happens, and it's dumb, and it needs to not be like that.
Yeah. That's really, there's a book that came out somewhat recently. It's called Who Gets In and Why. Have you heard of it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I heard about it. Yeah.
It's a really good book. And at one point, the author pauses to point out that like one of the kids he's following goes to a high school, I forget the size, but very, very small. And it's in a relatively rural area. And I think in the entire school, there were like 2 AP courses a kid could take before they graduated. And then he's comparing that, of course, with these gigantic schools in more affluent communities where many of the kids have a half dozen or more APs every year, sometimes starting as early as like freshmen or sophomores. And so he's making a more broad point about like, what is the admissions committee supposed to do about that when they have all these different things coming at them? But to your point, it really shows, I think in your field, in your roles, you're, I think, very aware of this, but I would guess that most of our listeners and their parents may not realize, like whatever school they go to, they probably think that that's how all the schools are mostly. That's really not the case though, right?
So no, and that's exactly, so when I went, after leaving this small school, I went and worked at KIPP Academy in the Bronx, and I was an 8th grade English teacher. And one of the things that, to your point, like they follow kids and they support them to and through college. And as an 8th grade teacher, before they had the high school where most of the kids now go, I would hear at the end of the school year where all the kids went to. So when you have kids going to like a tiny private boarding school in rural Connecticut, a great big comprehensive public high school in a different part of upstate New York, Exeter, Andover, Catholic schools, New York City, traditional publics, all of this stuff. So I became obsessed with where they were going next, because I was like, they are all coming from here and they're all funneling in. And the 53 of them, my very first year, all left this shared experience and went into wildly different high schools. And so it was also when I was rewatching all of the West Wing. So there's the what's next, and I was like, what's next? What's next? And like, it just rattled in the back of my head about like, how am I to prepare the same group of kids for such different,
for literally everything, any possible.
Right. And then, and I was both like inspired and like crushed when I would learn about different outcomes, because after a few years of teaching 8th grade English there, I asked the question, like, of the people who worked very conveniently right down the hall, who followed the children off to their next steps. I was like, how do I find out more about where they're going? And it turns out that there was an opening, and a very, very kind woman sort of like let me take another job that I was not qualified for at all. And it's like the theme of my life is just, like having very interesting opportunities that I could not necessarily say that I was qualified for, but I was so curious about and so willing to dig under it that I don't know, I just convinced them to. I have no idea. So I can't explain why I get hired. But
can I interrupt you yet again?
Yeah.
It's just that the reason I'm interrupting so often is you keep saying all these extremely interesting things, and I'm worried that if I wait until the very end of the description, that I'm going to sorget or whatever.
No, that's sorry
Mike,
to keep interrupt. That's
okay.
So trying to keep a list of things that I want to ask about when there's like an open. Go for it now.
So I'm just going to try to speculate as to like what the other side of those hiring decisions may have looked like to the people who are making those decisions. Because what you just said is something that has come up repeatedly in a variety of different interviews, that we've done with people across all kinds of different fields. And it's the idea of, well, you put it as curious, being curious. But I think what goes along with that and what definitely comes across when you speak is you're not just curious like, hey, what's happening to these kids, but I don't care about the kids. Like you actually clearly care. It's not just an academic curiosity. Like you're invested in, and I know you personally, you're invested in what happens with these young people and their educations. And I would bet that while maybe you didn't feel qualified, I couldn't, speak from a professional standpoint as to whether you were or not. My guess is that you were, but for the sake of argument, let's assume maybe you were a little unqualified for some of them. If I were hiring somebody, and I imagine you'd say the same thing if you're hiring somebody and you have somebody who has most of the pieces together on paper and is also just like super into the topic, goes out of their way to educate themselves, to follow up on outcomes and, hold themselves accountable in a way that isn't really required by the job, but they do it anyway. If you had that kind of person, you would hire them, right? I mean, I think.
I know. You're so nice. I know. I mean, but it's like, I think that there is something that's been a little like that door, I think was opened for me
You mean the one at KIPP, like the more administrative level at KIPP kind of thing? Is that what you're
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like I kind of showed a vested interest. I wrote recommendation letters for every single child. And it's like, I guess they knew that I had to care to some extent where they landed. So then if I'm expressing interest in following them and like, but here's the thing, the job that I was hired for was to be an academic counselor. Again, no one is trained for this. There is no like, and so it became because kids are going scattered to the four winds, sometimes living on their campuses in environments that are incredibly wealthy. It's very different from the zip code in the Bronx with the lowest income per capita. It was more than just being an academic counselor, right? Like you end up having to like explain to a kid, not explain, but you end up having to really open the door for the conversation that so many kids had, which is like, why does my roommate have so much? Like, why did they spend the summer in the south of France? Why did they, do these kinds of things? The job that I had was really more of like a mental health, emotional well-being, also academic counselor / college guide, all of that.
Like a life coach, sort of holistic kind of everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I barely have my life together. I did not have any of the same shared experiences that a lot of my students had. There was a part of me that's like, I wish that I had learned in grad school more of the social emotional part of being a teacher and then eventually, whatever other things in education, because that's the stuff that like, just like the tech in education, it's like every human in my classroom had a story and had a lived experience and all of this stuff. Right. But like, I didn't get a class in that. I got a class in a thing that none of them had access to. I was like, this is so...
You just had to use a 3D printer.
Right. It's like, thank you for that. Yeah. Now I'm going to go and do my actual job. Like, thank you for training for a totally irrelevant thing.
It's so... I want to say surprising. Unfortunately, it's not surprising anymore to me, but it's so poetic almost that the training for the teachers, which you would think is being done by really good teachers, doesn't touch on anything the teachers actually need. Like, it's just, I know that sounds like I don't think teachers ever do a good job. It's not what I'm saying at all. But like in an institutional kind of sense, we just hear story after story across all levels of education. Now with you, even like educating the educators, so often we hear about people getting educated about stuff that literally will not ever be a thing for them that they actually have to know. And then the stuff that they do need to know in many cases, as you mentioned, is just not getting covered. It's frustrating. I'm sure far more frustrating for you than it is for me just hearing about it, but it's frustrating even to hear about.
I don't know. Like at this point, I have alumni, kids I taught who are now teachers who have the same complaints that I was like, just remember right now, you're how old? 26. Remember that I was 26 when I was like, we were operating on the same lack of training and all. It is both poetic and deeply disturbing. That continues to be the fact.
Did you know that most schools don't care at all about your score on the SAT essay or the ACT essay? And the schools that do officially require an essay score for those tests seem to view that score as the absolute least important part of your application. In fact, they actually seem to ignore the essay score altogether, even if they won't admit that publicly. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear. I'm talking about the optional essay portion of the SAT and the ACT here. That's the thing that schools don't pay attention to, even when they request it. I am not talking about essays or personal statements that you submit as part of your actual application, because those definitely can be important. I'm just talking about the optional essay sections on the ACT and the SAT. If you want to learn more on this topic and save yourself the trouble of prepping for the optional essay on the ACT or the SAT, then stay tuned for the special segment at the end of this episode. And for more on the SAT and ACT, head over to questprep.com or search for the SAT Prep Black Book or the ACT Prep Black Book on Amazon.com.
Are you able now in your capacity to jump a little bit back? I mean, I still want to ask a bunch of questions about what the time period.
See, this is the thing. This is why you got to interrupt with your question.
Exactly.
Yeah, you have to. I'm sorry.
But to jump back to the present, since it's relevant in this organization that you're just starting working for, which, as you said, works in all kinds of capacities with schools and districts, and it sounds like just broadly improving student and teacher experiences in a variety of ways. Is there an opportunity there for you to try to address this need now? Like, have you ever had a chance to do that, to say, look, this is what I needed to learn when I was starting out and no one taught me? Like, how can we work that in? Or is that not really? I mean, I guess it sounds like what you're describing might have been something that would be taught more at a college level. And it sounds like you're working more with elementary school, middle school, high school sort of stuff. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not.
Yes. The answer to your question is yes. This organization could, and I think I'm not like totally fluent in all the contracts and stuff that they have, but I do think that they do work with teacher prep organizations and master's program, graduate programs and stuff like that. The irony of this, I do think things are better now. I mean, even though it's like just really hard work. And so my alumni are like, but the woman whose job I took, like the woman who was teaching 8th grade English at KIPP Academy was leaving to go to grad school, and I took her spot. She ended up co-founding Relay Grad School of Education. And so she ended up like starting a grad school for alternative certification.
Wow.
Which is, and she's like a genius. Those were some big shoes to fill, right? Like, so she's a genius and she's doing this really interesting stuff. And the reality too is like, if you're training teachers and this is their second career, if they didn't get undergrad, and I spent all of undergrad saying like, I don't want to be a teacher, like how you front load, how you prepare people for teaching is just so different, right? You're throwing them into the deep end and saying like, okay, we'll be there for you to like help you debrief. And like, there's a part of me, I mean, they're definitely doing trainings and stuff like that. But there's a part of me that is so far removed from what that training is currently that I'm not really sure if it's moved in a direction where it's like more useful and that kind of stuff.
Directly involved with it right now.
Yeah. I mean, but I'd love to be. And like, I love having these conversations with my alumni. I was counting the other day. I think it's either 10 or 12 kids that I worked with who are now elementary, middle, or high school teachers. And talking with them is so fun because and they're teaching all over the place, right? So one of them is at a private school and I'm like, and several are, at different KIPPs districts across the country, but hearing their experience is really eye-opening and fun. So
I think it's really useful and important to kind of build like the timeline of the stuff that you did, like moving from one job to the next. I think for a lot of people, especially people who have not yet entered the workforce, there's kind of like an aura of mystery over like how you go from like one position to the next to like how you make a change in your career.
I'm very glad that you corrected me when I said arc and you were like, no, that's way more work.
Not an arc. Nobody has an arc.
Right.
Yeah. Only in movies. So you mentioned being a paralegal and then you mentioned being a teacher a couple of years later at 22, I think. So if we could go back to like post high school, what happened post high school, I guess? What was the first school that you went to after that? And then how does that connect into, being a paralegal and then doing the tutoring a different Michael from this one and then that whole
other
thing.
Michael.
So if you could possibly, so I was curious about that.
I went to University of Florida after I graduated from high school. My mom didn't go to school in this country, and my stepdad was way older than my mom. And he had graduated with his PhD, but was sort of very removed from that process as it was when I went through the applying process. But I was an IB. So I had like friends who were way smarter than me and way more ambitious than I was. I was like, hey, they're signing up for the SAT. I guess I should do that. A rising tide lifted me. And then I got into Georgetown. Oh God, this was a crazy story. Anyway, I got into Georgetown and waitlisted at UVA. And
wait, sorry. This is for undergrad. You got into those places?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure I'm following. All right.
And I was doing my own FAFSA at the time. And so like I distinctly remember sitting at our tiny kitchen table and like screaming to my mom, "What's your social security number?" And she's like, "Why are you?" She's like in the laundry room and I'm like yelling very personal questions that I didn't realize were super personal, whatever. And so, I'm sitting there and I'm filling this out. And I definitely made a mistake on the FAFSA. And so when I got accepted and then we got our financial aid, the government seemed to think that I could afford $40,000 a year. No, it was like $28,000. I don't know how much it was. Something. I was like, I can afford this because it was the estimated family contribution, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So I got a $600 scholarship from Georgetown. And it's the only time that I can remember my stepdad crying on the couch because he like got it. He saw the financial aid before I did. And then he was like, "I know we told you if you got in, we would pay for it, but we can't pay for it."
Yeah.
And I was so salty. Like I was so mad because I had gone to visit Georgetown. I had the mug and the shirt and I was like, if I get in, oh my God. And all my friends were going to really I didn't know them, but I heard that they were good schools. Like what did I know? So when I went to campus to visit, am I going like a roundabout way?
No.
Is the answer?
No, this is good. Yeah. I'm just please getting
sorry.
But add in more people crying. I want the pathos. I want the whole.
Okay. The drama. Yeah, keep it.
Yeah. So I went to visit day or whatever at University of Florida, and I took a book. I sat at Mike, you might remember, there was the Union, and then there was you step down steps and there was this little pond or something.
Yeah,
I
vaguely remember.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where I spent 6 of the hours that I was on campus, and I just read, and
What'd you think of it?
The pond was lovely.
Great.
I can't tell you what book it was. I was like, I don't want to be here. I do not want to be here. I earned a different spot. I want to be in a different, I was so pretentious and snobby. I cannot believe the human I was. I'm whatever. And so then I went back. I did the very mandatory things of registering for classes and stuff. I went back. And then when it was time to move, my stepdad was sick. My stepdad had gotten diagnosed with cancer when I was right before I left Orlando to go up to Gainesville. And so my mom helped me with the move. And so we got to the campus and it's just me and my mom. And we move all the stuff into the god awful elevators. And I remember she's dropping me off and I take the very first thing I took out of a box was my Georgetown mug.
I was going to say, I thought it was a Georgetown.
And I slammed it on those hideous desks in the dorms. Yeah. And my mom looks at me and she says, "We can take all of this stuff downstairs and go right back home if you want." And I was like, now looking back, I'm like, that is the most mom answer that ever happened. And I was like, no, I'm going to stay here. I mean, God, I'm so grateful that it happened that way, because what it meant was I was driving distance from my home when my stepdad was dying. I was not taking out crazy loans. So when I graduated, I was able to do what I wanted to do instead of what I was going to earn me the most money to pay back the loans. And there was no way I understood that freedom when I was sitting there and mad that my parents weren't blah, blah, blah. And I was like able to try different things. Like I didn't have this pressure of like, I have to get good grades because I'm taking out all this money so that I can get into a good, all of that was kind of lifted. And I was able to just like be myself and follow things that were kind of interesting, make friends like this Mike, not the other Mike yet. And so it felt very different, but you couldn't have convinced senior me that this me was going to be grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah, that's such a big thing. I think about that all the time for myself. And I'm sure that a lot of people, have similar once they've been through the process and they're a few decades out from college. And part of it too is, so look at this, this place that you're in now, these accomplishments that you've put together, professionally, and all the lives that you've changed and affected. This is hard to describe, but like, I don't think senior year or me, when I was at that age, like I was so fixated on which school and which like name and like which campus and which city was it in and all this stuff. It's dumb, but I mean, I'm more than twice as old now as I was then. Like every day that I was alive before I graduated high school, I've had an extra day of being alive. It's hard to
how long that is.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify. And you look back and it's not that you knew. I mean, I'm speaking for you, but stop me if I'm wrong. It's not that you knew the path you were going down. You didn't, but without knowing it, you were going down a path that was going to give you all these opportunities. And who knows what the other opportunities would have been on the other path.
Right.
It's not that one's better. It's just that this turned out very well. Right. In a lot of ways.
Yeah. But, and here's the thing, right? Like, so so we'll go back to the question. So the question was, how do you get the first thing? And then how do you get the second thing, right? The first
I forgot that was the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry.
No,
that's okay.
You guys can talk for 5 hours. I'm here, my cat can come through all the time in the world. The first job after college was like a desperation. Like I graduated early technically, but then I was like freaked out. And so I still wanted to get the financial aid and I went to DC. Let me back up a little bit. Mm-hmm. Senior year, I went to DC to do an internship where I also had a very mom moment where my mother said, wait a second, I'm paying for other people to have you work for them for free. Like what is happening? And I was like,
how is that even legal?
I know.
This is a great deal for somebody.
Okay?
She's like, why is this? It's not your rent. I'm paying for you to work for. Okay.
So to be clear, you were getting like academic credit for this internship. Is that how it worked?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
I was getting academic credit. I was getting a lot of coffee.
So it was like a class in the form of an internship in DC. And what was I'm not sure if you mentioned at this point, like what was your major? What kind of credits were you getting? Like what was the context of all this academic?
Oh yeah. So I majored in English. I don't know if I actually filled out the form to major in Spanish or minor in Spanish, but I took all the classes for minoring and I should check my transcript at some point, but whatever.
Which is another thing. Sorry. Look how little, I mean, Spanish, obviously, but like, look how little that ended up. Like
nothing.
Yeah, not even being sure whether.
I remember I took all the classes for a Russian major except one. And my friends at the time were like, you should really take that extra class. Like, you're going to regret not having that Russian major on your transcript. And even
that's
then,
going to come back and bite you.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if that's true. Anyway, sorry, please go ahead.
I think learning who the bursar was a moment for me. And I was like, what's the bursar? Why do they keep sending me something? And what do I have? Whatever. So similarly, I don't think I knew to submit the thing, whatever. But I majored in English, took a lot of Spanish classes. When I graduated, when I was still in college, I applied for this DC internship and I worked at Vital Voices, which was actually started by a lot of former Hillary Rodham Clinton people after she left her role in I don't know where I guess it was when she was first lady. I don't know how old this is, but so I worked with a lot of.
What did Vital Voices do? Sorry.
Yeah, they did work on women's rights, women like empowerment. They had like a big conference every year where they brought together, just like amazing women. So that was really cool. But I was living in DC. Oh, this is where it gets a little fun and dramatic. Okay, so I was living in
Mike loves that. This Mike. I don't know about other Mike.
I was dating someone who was not approved by my mother, and he was connected in different ways pretty significantly in DC. So I didn't go back to University of Florida for my graduation because I didn't want to. My mom is still mad. So when I graduated, I had $4.24 in my bank account.
Scary.
Yeah. So, and I was like, like, I did not think this.
Okay, what happens next?
That is, for the audience.
Checkmate, Mom.
Yeah. That's almost $10 in today's dollars. So.
Right. Adjusted for inflation.
Right.
Still not. So I really freaked out. And the guy that I was dating was older. And I was like, so I've graduated from college and I don't have a job.
Right.
Hi. And he was like, look, I can help, like, consider applying to these places, like, blah, blah, blah. So that was how I got my first job. Not something I'm particularly proud of.
So you said he helped you apply to some or what was
he like knew people. He knew people at different law firms.
Okay.
So he just reached out to some hiring partners and said,
and at this point, at that point, you still wanted to be a lawyer, right? Was that correct?
I did. Yeah. So I still thought I was going to go into law, and I thought, okay, I didn't apply to law school yet. And so I just wanted to get a job and figured I should get a job at a law firm. And I could not have told you, like, I couldn't have named a law firm before this, right? Like I didn't know. I was just so like green and didn't know anything. So so he was like, okay, apply to these few places and call this person as a follow-up and whatever. And so I got that job. And I mean, it was like kind of an amazing job because it was at a really big law firm that had lots of really cool, interesting clients. So on September 11th or September 10th, 2001, I was at the law firm. And that's when I first met my friend Maria, who plays, significantly later in my path. But that was her first day of working at the firm. And then, September 11th happened. The whole world turned upside down. Then she went off to the New York City Teaching Fellows that year. And then we stayed in touch. And so when it was time that I but that moment for me was like, am I doing something that matters?
You're saying 9/11 gave you that?
9/11, yeah.
That made you have this sort of like reflecting on your life and your purpose and all that kind of
stuff. And just in like, I could tell you what client I was working for and stuff at the time, but none of it mattered. And I remember sort of thinking later, like I grounded myself in, I need to do something that matters. So I started sort of thinking, okay, maybe it's law, but maybe it's a different kind of law and maybe it's public interest and that kind of stuff. And that's the direction I was curious in. And so I took the LSAT and applied to some law schools and stuff like that. But the whole time on a regular basis, I'm still talking to Maria and she is like happy and working harder than she had ever worked, even at this crazy law firm where we worked insane hours. And she's like, no, this is harder, but it's better. And the more I would talk to her, the more I knew, okay, that is something that I want to try. And so somehow in these conversations with her, I somehow learned separately of this tutoring opportunity. And it was, hey, I took enough Spanish where I could, even though my transcript may or may not have Spanish as a minor, I could be helpful in a way, and I could try it on. So like, I'm a huge fan of trying things on before jumping into it. And so I tried on teaching, even though it was not teaching with a capital T, it was teaching with a lowercase t. I knew I liked it and I knew it would like fulfill me. So then down the road, I applied to the teaching fellows. But the thing with the teaching fellows, so this, to your question of how do you get the second thing? So you get into the program, but you have to get your own job. You have to get your own public school teaching job in, to Mike's earlier point, this behemoth of the New York City Department of Education. Yeah. So I'm literally, I don't know if it's pre-Google, but it's certainly pre-Google.
Yeah. Google. Yeah. You would just say Google in a normal voice, not a scary voice.
Yeah. Back when you could have a conversation and Google didn't hear it.
Yeah.
It was then.
I mean, it wasn't yet a verb at the very least, right?
Yeah.
So
gotcha.
I was like, how do I find out? Well, I'm in DC trying to find a public school teacher job in New York City.
And those are,
so you're in DC, your friend Maria is in New York City that you're talking
She's in New York City. I get accepted to the program and I have a couple months to find the job that the program requires me to have. Okay. I, of course, thought this would all be way easier and was like,
yeah.
So I just cold call a whole bunch of different high school principals. Now when I think back on it, I'm like, I cannot believe anyone answered the phone. Like,
they were kind of busy. I'm gonna guess.
Right.
Do you know how big these schools are? We have schools in these schools.
Things.
Yeah.
But then there's like a job fair. I learn finally of some sort of the job fair and I go and I don't even remember this conversation, but I mean, look, like those schools, public schools are in desperate need of teachers. So the fact that they hired me does not speak to my qualifications or skill. It speaks to like supply and demand and like, so yeah. And then I moved to New York and I started that. But I will tell you that this recently in the last few years is the first time that I've realized that I didn't go through the typical process to get jobs. I would often work really, really hard at whatever I was doing because I liked it and I wanted to be good at it. And then I would sort of like listen to hear other things and then hope I knew someone who could put in a good word for me or could speak to like my effort or whatever it was, because, I know that's a level of privilege that I got so early on. Like my foot in the door was a function of this guy I was dating, which is insane and wrong.
Kinda. But I mean, you also worked really, really hard. I don't disagree with what you're...
That's very nice of you.
It's not that you didn't do anything.
Well, can I ask sort of like a related higher level question before we move anywhere further?
Yeah.
You were saying, I only realized later that I didn't do like the normal way to get these jobs.
Yeah.
How much of that do you think might be, and this is just like many things, a theme that comes up a lot, and I think is one of the big, as we said, I think when we were in the warm up to the start of the actual interview, that we kind of see ourselves as like what we're trying to be anyway is one of the few resources, maybe the only one, speaking to high schoolers and college students and really potentially anybody who's just looking for another possibility in a career or an education related decision or whatever, but primarily high schoolers and college age students. and we are trying to give them real stories from real people where people don't have the obligation to feel like, well, I did this, but I feel like I should really say that they should do that instead because what I did probably won't work. You know what I mean? There's the kind of that sense that so many, I think, teachers and counselors in a completely well-meaning way, they don't really feel like sharing their actual experience necessarily will be useful for them. So they give a more generic, work hard, do this, go through these channels, even if they don't actually know anybody who's even done that specific thing, because everybody's life story, as you said, it's not an arc, it's a winding path that doesn't make any sense. You know, that's more the norm than not. So do you think it's possible when you say, well, I didn't do the normal way of getting these jobs, is that not even the normal way? Is that just what people think everybody else does, even though they didn't do it? You know what I mean? Because most of what I feel like we hear is kind of, well, I was in this situation, I didn't know what to do, I talked to this person, they knew somebody, I heard about this thing. You know, everybody, the details of all these things seem very incidental for everybody. And I feel like it creates this perception of like, well, other people do this, but it worked out this other way for me, and that was weird. So is it possible, do you think, that maybe what you describe, some version of what you experienced, might be more common than many people think, but it's just nobody gives that advice, so it feels like it's like the weird way to do it? You know what I mean? Is there?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And upon reflection, like I think of how many kids that I've worked with to apply to, they got accepted to great colleges, went off, and then their first jobs, it is their network of people. It becomes their friends and family and maybe partners or significant others or whatever. And like they're in that way, I think a little bit the game feels rigged, because I think that when you tell kids, if you do X, Y, and Z, this will, that there's like a straight line to from here to there. It's not really an algorithm like that. And I do see time and time again, it's kind of like this connection or that connection. Like the number of opportunities that I've heard about because someone has said, hey, I thought about you for this thing. That's when I decide to go to another thing, because I'm like, oh, that's cool. You know, like that's interesting. I trust that person, or I like their path is interesting enough for mine to intersect with it. So yeah, I think that that's one of those things that is so true, but it's like kind of unspoken because you want it to be fair. Like I think everybody wants people to be able to have access to the same things. But the reality is that people are leveraging all of their different relationships. And when you open the door, when you're in a position where you can influence other people, it's like, it's when you can scoop people in and say like, I can vouch for this person, I can vouch for that person. And it's how I've operated, like maybe in the last 10 years. Like when I was a classroom teacher, it's like, if you work hard enough, you can get this opportunity. When I've worked in college counseling and now beyond it, I'm like, I will vouch for you. And to me, I will give my time. I will support you. I will put you, because to me, that door is more, not more important, but it is equally important to whatever credentials and you know, stuff the kid has. And so that's kind of the thing that like I feel like is missing in a lot of preparation for anything programs.
Nobody is talking about this.
No,
idea.
It's not like, it's not networking in the LinkedIn necessarily kind of way. It's networking in like your the person that you used to go out to happy hour with.
It's more just like actual human networking, like unintentional networking, basically, like organic kind of, oh, you just know that person. But I think there's enough, like you mentioned vouching for somebody, you mentioned the idea of trust. And I was just thinking about the same idea when you were saying earlier, like, oh, like I was underqualified, but somebody, you know, some crazy person gave me this job, even though I wasn't, you know, should never have gotten it or whatever. And as along with Mike, I suspect that you're just more qualified than you thought you were. But I think a big part of it too is, if you think about it, anybody in a position of hiring someone, is taking a risk, either because it might go badly and somebody who's their boss might get mad at them for making a bad choice, or the person ends up wasting their time or is unreliable or whatever. And if you like that barrier of like being able to say, well, I trust this person, I know this person, or I know somebody really well and they know this person, and say that, like, that means so much. And it doesn't have to be, it can be like nefarious, I'm sure, but it doesn't have to be. It can be just an honest, like, listen, I need to know this person will show up on Tuesday. And there can be a person who just walked in the door, I've never heard of them before, or my good friend's a good friend and they're qualified, or maybe slightly underqualified possibly, but like, I believe that they're going to give it their all, that they're engaged. As Mike said, you demonstrated like you care about these kids, you have time in this system or whatever it is. That has so much value and is such a big part of it. And as you said, nobody's like teaching this. And one thing that also has come up a lot is the idea of like, oh, well, it's who you know, that plays a big role. But you can make more connections than you have. Anybody can make a first connection and a second connection. It might start in a different place, but in the interest of saying, well, okay, maybe you have no network right now. That could be unfortunate. It is, you know what I mean? But like, what's a step we can take? And like, well, apply for internships someplace or whatever it is, or just get a part-time job anywhere. Like, start any place, demonstrate, become a person that somebody else would say, oh, I vouch for this person, I trust this person shows up when they're supposed to, is communicative, that kind of thing. That can be just a very valuable step that people don't adequately express to teenagers or whoever, people trying to kind of make their way in the world. Just starting with any kind of relationship at all in the beginning can be valuable if you don't know where else to go, even if it's doesn't feel like where you want to end up, like you end up, as you said, you hear about something, you get to know somebody you didn't, in a way you didn't plan, couldn't have planned, but just getting engaged, getting involved in whatever you're able to get engaged and involved in can lead to lots more stuff than you might initially think, just by making those connections or whatever.
Yeah. I think it's very easy for kids, especially high school and college kids, to think that they do not have a community of people who could open the doors for them.
Exactly. It's so easy to feel like you should just give up before you even start. Like, well, If I don't know anybody, never mind. And it's unfortunate because if they just knew, you can make more progress than you think, you know what I mean? Just like kind of believe in it for long enough to take a few steps down that path. And you'll probably, get to know some people, hear about something you didn't know about. The world will start to open up, you know what I mean? A little bit. And it's not going to be the exact same thing for every person, but it's also from a perspective of being realistic. Like, the position that you're in might be unfair or unfortunate or whatever. And for most people, it is certainly in some regard. But from the perspective of like, what's the next best step I can take given where I am? Usually it's something like that. Get involved in something, join a club, get an internship, plug yourself into some kind of community, people who are having these conversations or involved in organizations or whatever.
Yeah. And I think too, like I would learn in sitting down with families when I was doing college counseling, completing the CSS profile or the FAFSA or whatever it was. It was a blind spot for them to realize that their parents and their parents' coworkers or their parents, whatever, like that kind of connection, or their coach or their AV teacher might have, like these kinds of connections feel not the same type of valuable. And in those conversations, I'd be like, what does your mom do? That's one of the questions. What does your mom do? And it's like, I don't know. She goes to this. It's like, that's a good starting place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, during COVID, everyone knows what their parents do because not everyone,
you're watching them do it.
If they're doing it at home, you're acutely aware of their job.
Yeah.
And I think that's an easier entry point kind of for kids. And I think it doesn't have to be adults. Some of the best people in my professional network are people who have been my friends since high school, my IB friends, my college friends. Those people are still people who are opening my mind to either opportunities or inviting me to sit on a podcast or but that's real. And I think it's just like, it's undersold because it feels like there's this, secret society of people who are opening the doors.
Yeah. And maybe there is,
right?
Who knows? If it is, I'm not in it, but there might be that, but there's also like, don't undervalue yourself and your own connections. They don't feel like capital C connections. You can't get Bill Gates on the phone, but right. There's people that and then those people know people, and like there's a lot of value even to my coworker's kid is really interested in this, and I know that you do that, so would you talk to him? That can happen, but it can happen for sure if you're not even trying to start that conversation, if you're not even asking your mom and dad or whoever you have available to you, hey, I think I might be into this. Like, do you know anybody I could maybe talk to about that? Or ask your friends, maybe one of their parents does it or something. It is very unfortunate that I feel like a lot of kids have a lot more at their fingertips than they might realize, and they just never even explore it to just find out.
Yeah.
Just because it feels pointless before you start. You just think, well, I'm not anybody. I don't have, my cousin isn't the mayor or whatever. I don't have this kind of social capital, but they have more than they think most people do. And mathematically, there's more people than you realize that are just a couple people away from you. If you look at your friends, your siblings, your parents, your neighbors, if you got a part-time job someplace, the people you meet through that, that starts to expand out way more than is easy to appreciate until you start doing it. And then something kind of falls, quote unquote, falls in your lap, but really it's because you're engaging with the world, and you couldn't have predicted that one thing would have gone that way. But it's likely that something would go in a certain direction, that you could work with.
To Shirin's point earlier too, when you were saying, Shirin, you want to believe that the algorithm or whatever to follow is more about like doing hard work and good work. But it's, as you said, it's the network is obviously a part of it. In a way, though, the hard work and the good work, it kind of still is part of it, because when it comes time for someone to vouch for you, you have to be a person worth vouching for. You have to.
Yeah, if you're not demonstrating that, then all this goes out the window.
Yeah, all
right, right.
Yeah, curiosity and so it's not
dependability, reliability. Yeah,
right. And obviously, I don't think any of us is saying that every single person deserves every good thing that happens to them, because that's clearly not true.
Right.
But if you are trying to figure out like what's something I can do, then yeah, you have to be, as much as possible, you got to take steps to try to provide value for other people, and it doesn't have to be a thing that you are, it's not a show you're putting on. Like, Shirin, you really do care about those kids. Like, you want them.
It's true.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah. And, we've spoken with other people who really did, like, they cared about being like, how can I be the best secretary at this job, in this company? How can I be the best engineer, contractor, whatever? Like, what can I do that's going to actually like help move the needle on whatever this organization is trying to do? And if you keep that in your mind, obviously no one can guarantee anything, but I think it dramatically raises the likelihood that at some point someone will notice what you've been doing, and they'll have an opportunity to, help pull you along to some other thing.
Yeah. And I think that there's also this component that I've seen with students that I've worked with, where they get an experience. So I worked at a small school here in Dallas, and I was the dean of college prep. So I was sort of in charge of like all things guidance, and then the college. That's pretty cool. Yes, the dean of college prep. Yeah. So titles in education just crack me up. But managers
I was
don't
the executive viceroy. Yeah.
Like ridiculous. But something that came front of mind to me at this small school was when kids at smaller schools don't always have the same extracurricular opportunities, right? Like there were only a couple electives. Mike, to your point earlier about a couple APs, colleges have kind of figured out, as long as there's a profile, they're able to compare kids, sort of, did you take the biggest risks, all that stuff. So I would talk to kids about this all the time, but it was when we would have kids go off to college, and it was only then when they were able to try on all these other things that they realized not only the thing that they were maybe more interested in or differently interested in or whatever professionally, but also just their friend groups would grow to include lots of different people. And so you have kids who are like gung-ho in one direction, but because they met people in different ways, maybe they majored in the thing that they thought they were going to major in, but maybe they pursued a career in a sort of slightly different angle because of those relationships and connections. And that was really interesting to work with kids who came from a small school who were applying to college, because sometimes they wanted the big college experience. I mean, it's Texas, so they wanted it for like football and parties and all that stuff, but also because it's like, I've only ever been at a small school, and like, I don't know a lot of people. And so just at a bigger school, I can like just know a lot more people. And I'm like, that's amazing that you felt that way, because at University of Florida, like, I tried to make the big school small, and I think
school
that
within a school.
Yeah,
Theme of your whole life.
It seems to be a thing for me. But I can see it a little bit more with alumni that I've worked with, like the openness to something else, like that they hadn't tried, or to people in groups that they hadn't necessarily connected with before. It's really been cool to see them go off and do cool things. So yeah, I don't know. That sort of ties to.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it does. Yeah.
I have a question that's not related to any of this. It goes back to something that you talked about earlier.
Cool.
Is that all right? You actually kind of sort of halfway addressed something I'm about to ask you about. But so this group that you're about to go work with, that you're transitioning towards, do you know how so they're a nonprofit. Sorry, let me frame why I'm asking you this. One of the themes that's come up a lot in these different talks we're having is, first of all, that people find their way into positions that they literally didn't know existed, when they were in college or high school, or probably even getting your master's. I don't know if you knew that this particular thing you're about to do was a thing that someone could do. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't even know that teachers existed outside of whatever. So I would have had no idea. And part of why people end up in jobs they couldn't have known about is you don't know every job when you're, still being educated, but also jobs are like evolving all the time. I mean, new titles, new roles, new needs and stuff. So another thing we've kind of touched on a lot is that there are a variety of different types of organizations that can pay you to work for them. There are nonprofit groups, governmental groups. Obviously, there are large corporations, small companies. You can be a sole proprietor or an entrepreneur or any of those kinds of things. So part of what I like to kind of dig into, because I think it's helpful to understand, just so our listeners can get a growing sense of just how the world works, and also me too, because I don't know either. For this new employer, how do they? It's a very crass question, but like, where does the money come from, and how does it get up? Like, how does it end up being
just like the operation of the actual?
Yeah, it sounds like there's people out there working for your new employer who are maybe part of their job is getting these contracts going and like finding. How does all that work as far as you know? And maybe, I don't know if you maybe don't know from this company, but I'm guessing you've been on the client side before in the past, probably at different times. Like, can you just sort of elaborate on that as much as possible?
I don't totally understand how they generate new business, but I do know that they do a lot of research. So one of the ways that I think people learn about them is they do big research projects, and then they share the knowledge that they've learned from those. So when you and I were at South by, when you both and I were at South by, at some point in that giant convention center, there were all those vendors, right? And I remember, I don't know if we walked through this together on one of the times that we went through it, or if I was there by myself, but they were there and they were presenting on the opportunity myth, which is essentially a lot of what we've been talking about, which is like, if you're a kid in a public school district and you're told, if you do X, Y, and Z, these are the opportunities that will open up to you. The reality is that those two things weren't happening.
Yeah, the connection isn't really there,
right.
Practically.
So, and we were definitely at a presentation of theirs where they focused on the quality of assignments and readings and stuff like that kids were asked to do, and tied them directly to the opportunities that they would have afterwards. And they named like this needs to improve in order for this to not be a myth, right? So I think the way that they gain the most attention and then subsequently business is by researching and learning and digging into sort of big topics around education, like finding an outcome and then publishing that and sort of finding a perspective that aligns with their missions and with the research that they found, and saying like, so I think that's why they do a lot of work around the teacher talent pipeline, because they've done some research around the inequities there and how you need more diverse teacher and you need strong teacher pipelines in order to have strong classrooms, to have strong outcomes and all that stuff. So I think that's how they do it. And then I think there's another component of a lot of these people were leaders at different schools and districts and communities. And so when they're in that capacity, they are reaching out for thought partners. And this is an organization that's pretty well known for being a pretty good thought partner and doing good work. So I think that's how the operational side of it and making the money. But I also know that, to our earlier point of like, teachers don't get a lot of the training. People who become principals often become principals because they were good teachers, but those skill sets
are the same job.
Correct. Like, so it's another really bonkers way of saying like, oh, you're an excellent physician, you should run this hospital. Not the same thing, right? And we typically wouldn't ask that of those two different roles. So I think it's the same idea of like, you can be a really good classroom teacher, but there's figuring out the development of adults. Andragogy is different than pedagogy. And so if you're teaching adults, you need to teach them differently. And so I think school leaders and district leaders and stuff like that maybe don't have a foothold in that as strongly as outside organizations might, because they've sort of done it for a while.
That reminds me, sorry, this is slightly off topic, but what you just said. Well, first of all, because I didn't know these words when I was in high school or college, andragogy would be like the teaching
of adults.
Of adults, right? Pedagogy would be for children. But what you said just reminded me of a story. A friend of ours is an IB history teacher. And actually, the way she got that job was also somewhat of a surprise to her. But so she was an IB history teacher, and there was this big IB conference at some like nice, like destination, kind of a place, and the districts all pay for like a certain number of teachers to like go to this thing, and it's like a big deal for the teacher to get picked to be the one who's going to go to the conference. Partly because it's an academic and professional honor, but also because it's just nice to have a little paid vacation to this place. Right. So anyway, she told us that we were going to meet her somewhere because it happened to be like around here that the destination was. And so we met up with her for dinner after, I think, like the second night of like 5 nights or something. And she said that like as the day wore on, I think the final thing ended at say like 4 or 4:30. She said around 3:45, you could see all the teachers like texting each other, like making plans to leave. Like they're all acting exactly like 15-year-olds would act like near the end of and the lecturer had to be like, guys, I can see you looking at your phones. Like, please, like,
eyes up here, everybody.
Right. Which again, I was just what you mentioned. It was a funny little thing. But that's everything that you said makes a lot of sense. And it's an interesting way to try to, I don't want to say that the organization is prospecting for clients by doing that, because that sounds maybe kind of, what's the word, calculating. I don't think they view it as a calculating thing, but they're simultaneously providing a lot of value to anyone who might read this research or, whatever. And then also if somebody out there in their audience is like, hey, this company would be a great, company for me to work with. It kind of actually, in a way, is like a company level or an organization level version of what we just described people should be doing, like the
networking sort of.
Yeah, the organization is making itself useful to the field. and saying,
kind
like,
of
here's all this stuff.
communicating with other
Right. And then other people are finding out about that and saying, hey, like, this is well done work. Why don't you come help us? I'm assuming that's basically how it goes, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is effective because teaching does feel so much like a silo. So if you're, a school leader, even if you are a part of a larger district and stuff like that, everybody, there's no sort of lockstep thing that's happening because communities are different, needs are different, that kind of thing. So it is really kind of cool to hear people, even if they're soliciting for like input from other people who are working in this organization. It's like, hey, I'm working with the city of blank and we're doing blah, blah, blah. And then like a small town client might have a really great idea for that. And they don't talk to each other necessarily, but as an organization, we see and hear those
a receptacle
things
for all these sort of concepts and solutions.
Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of like knowledge sharing, but also just like collaboration. Like why are we doing this alone and by ourselves for the first time when 13,000 other districts are doing it at the same time? So
yeah.
I'm excited about that. And that's kind of cool to be a part of. So
when you guys, or this group, I don't know if it's appropriate to say you guys yet, since you're not technically part of the group yet, but you've already done,
that's true. Yeah.
You know what I mean? When you,
These people
who do this kind of thing, when you mentioned that they collect data, what kind of data is that they're collecting and what kinds of ways is that data analyzed?
For the opportunity myth, I think it was like 4,000 students across like 3 different districts and like surveys, but also work samples looking at what 4th graders across all these different spaces were doing. And so it's that, but it's also like the types of impacts that it could have. So on my project, for example, that I've been working on part-time, it's focusing on the teacher and the student responses to the survey and we're hoping that, things around, I am learning a lot during remote instruction. I am engaging with my peers during remote instruction. Those kinds of numbers go up when we do the post survey. But in a normal world, you'd have so much more data, qualitative and quantitative. But now it's kind of like, when you don't have clear data, it's a little bit trickier to like the before and after becomes really hard because what was before, like everything was before and everything now is after. Like,
yeah.
So that'll be interesting to see, just in terms of testing and stuff like that, the typical data that's used in education, how that changes. I mean, I feel like you guys probably have a clearer sense of how that
actually
might change.
I was just having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine who I hope will also be on the show at one point. Josh, if you're listening, talking to you. And he's involved in basically like, a lot of things, but one thing in particular is data collection and various ways to use data, like in figuring out how to improve educational outcomes, which is exactly what you just, described. He said some interesting stuff. I don't want to put words in his mouth or misquote him, but as I recall, he was saying, and he works more at the graduate and postgraduate levels, but he was saying that a lot of the professors that he works with, now that they've seen that there's stuff they can measure via online interactions and like platforms and stuff, there's stuff that can be measured in terms of, I'm imagining things like how often people speak up and, and like what kinds of like real-time feedback can they give by clicking a box or all this kind of stuff. Now that some people are realizing that you can measure some of that stuff, they're not going to want to give it up when it goes back to, the other thing. So not that it's like perfect data that trumps the value of all other data, but it was a new kind of data that you now had a lot more of than you used to have. And you can run all kinds of analytics and algorithms and AIs against it and like try to figure out new insights about what works and what doesn't. So yeah, one thought that he seemed to have is that there's some level of that that's likely to continue for a while.
I mean, I hope so. Like, otherwise, Like, that sucks.
Well, and actually that kind of leads me to my second quick question before we go back to Patrick's. This is sort of a silly thing to ask, but I'm just curious, would you care to make any predictions about what life will be like, educational life, like after the restart, so to speak? Would you care to go out on a limb, say that you think it's going to be any particular way, and then we can come back and say whether you got it right or not? It's okay if you don't want
Does
to.
that sound fun to you? Yeah, think carefully before you decide to take advantage of this opportunity.
Oh my gosh. You guys are hilarious. I think it changes like 13,000 different ways. I don't think there's one like overarching kind of thing. I will say the district that I just wrapped up working for, the superintendent there had a really cool vision for schools there. He wanted, and this was just as the pandemic at mid-March, he was saying, look, what if schools became not school buildings, but they became sort of community hubs, and teachers, some of them were doing the online learning or teaching, but some of them were there as like coaches to kids and, tutors and that kind of thing. And it became a more fluid kind of space where kids could also advance as quickly as they wanted to, or get all the extra, all of this. Like, his vision for it was amazing. The politics behind it were insane and didn't fall out. But I thought to myself, that's maybe a possibility for a district or some districts in more sort of progressive or flexible spaces. But yeah, I don't know. At the end of the day, that's one thing that I learned during COVID is that schools, like education, is like the backbone of the economy, which I did not. It sounds so silly that I didn't ever think of it that way, but like, I was like, oh yeah, like if we don't have schools, like no one can go to work.
Right.
Like, it's like crazy.
Yeah, sorry. In two ways, just to build off what you said, it's partly the like day to day, like the young people need a place to go, and if they don't have a place to go, then right. Yeah. But there's also, if schools over the long term are not turning out, I don't know, literate, mathematically literate, literate graduates, then the economy also will suffer eventually, which is what I thought you meant at first, but no, like in a more immediate sense.
Yeah, it's just like
people
for the next few days. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but
yeah, no, I mean, but that's part of it too, right? Like then you're seeing, like I observed as a part-time in this thing, I observed a bio teacher teaching a biology class where the discussion, and this was like 3 or 4 months ago, was about how a virus mutates. And is it going to mutate to become more deadly or more infectious? And before the first variant of COVID came out, that group of young people were talking with their biology teacher about how it could mutate and how evolution will happen super duper fast. And you're going to see it and my mind is blown, because then I literally am watching the news and I'm like, when kids say, when are you ever going to use this stuff? It's like, oh my God.
Well, this one
right now. Yeah.
Crazy. And I was both moved by that, but I was also like, this is the push pull of like, when you're trying to get everybody back into buildings, the science is real, the math, exponents. All of a sudden, kids understand exponents.
Yeah, you're watching it happen. Yeah.
Correct. So I don't know that you can predict what education is going to be like, but it will be very interesting to see what groups are most positively impacted by all of this and what groups are the most negatively impacted. Like, I think, our kids are young, right? So they have been able to adapt really easily. I think a lot about, is it middle school kids that are going to go back and be like, rah! Like, I don't have a sense of cohort of children. And also like adults. I keep thinking to myself, like the nurses who graduated like last year.
Man. Yeah. What was that for them?
Wow.
There are a whole slew of professionals who didn't do the things at the very end of the last leg of the race. They didn't
just got pushed out early to
Right.
join the fight. Yeah.
Well, Patrick. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I just don't know what happens with that. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. We'll see.
Patrick said something at the beginning of all of this that has stuck with me a lot. He said that we're living through something that's going to be studied retrospectively in every field.
Yes.
Economists are going to, doctors are going to, educators, engineers, everything that you can think of is going to look back at this period of time as something that was in some way monumental for, some kind of sea change in the way that something was thought of.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
I mean, and in every country, in every geographic space in this world,
nuts.
Bonkers.
So you don't want to hazard a prediction on this.
You don't want to take all that on the record right now.
Good.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
So here, after that incredibly short interlude for a mic question I wanted to ask an age ago. So getting back into your personal timeline, there was graduating from school because of that internship thing. You ended up in DC as at the time that you graduated. I had no money. So just necessity, ended up through a connection you had, getting a job as a paralegal, not fulfilling, but a person you met there turned you on to something that was more interesting to you. Ended up going through that New York teacher development thing, whose name I'm not thinking of at this moment. Ended up in New York City. And then you have mentioned since then that you ended up at KIPP, but I don't think you described the jump from the initial New York job. You said you worked there, you ended up being sucked into the school within a school or whatever. And then at some point after that, ended up working with KIPP, which we've alluded to. I don't know that we've specifically described exactly what KIPP is and how you came to be connected to that. So if you could possibly describe that.
Yeah. So I was really struggling at the school that I was at, my second school in the New York City Department of Education. And so I went with a friend of mine.
When you say struggling, can you elaborate on that?
Just the work environment was really rough. I adored the children that we worked with and, had helped found that school. But a lot, it was wild. We'll go back to, it was wild. So I needed to find a different spot. So, and another friend of mine who also helped co-found the school was going to a job fair. And she said, if you want, you can come with me. She was double certified to teach math and physics. So, and I was only certified to teach English. So I was like, okay, sure, I'll join you as a wing woman through this, but you're going to get 17 offers and I'm going to walk out of there with my resume.
Thanks a lot in advance.
But I also really truly had been considering leaving education. I was so
oh, really?
Yeah, I was really discouraged and sad at the way that everything had sort of happened at that school.
Do you want to ask you more about that, but not in a way that forces you to give details that you don't want to?
Do you mean politically, administratively, or?
Yeah, totally. Just entirely on the adult level.
It was not being managed, not being handled well in some way.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I sort of was having this change of heart. Maybe I had finished the 2 years that the New York City Teaching Fellows required. So I had a little bit more flexibility, but I loved kids and I loved working in schools. And so I went with her just as an exercise in supportive friendship and, curiosity. Yeah. I took one copy of my resume. Yeah.
If anyone is listening to this who might be thinking about situations when they would need a copy of their resume, you always need more than one. You're never going to only need one. This is not a what to do. This is a what to do. But I think that in a lot of ways, my mentality going into this was if I find the most amazing place, then I will have one resume to hand them, but it's going to need to be that good.
The golden resume. Who gets
I
it?
can imagine you, like, as you're handing it over, you lock eyes with the person. You're like, you don't know how meaningful this is.
Yeah.
I only have one of these.
Yeah.
But you go into space when you feel like you have nothing to lose, you go into spaces so differently, right?
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
I wasn't desperately trying to find another school to work at.
Yeah.
I was like,
If anything, you were
see-
trying not to find another school. To work.
Yeah.
and like in a lot of ways, I was just sort of so sure that my friend would be such a more qualified, appealing kid. I mean, you just cannot find math and physics certified teachers. So I just was, curious. So I'm walking up to tables with the confidence that I wish I had in high school. Like, who does that? Like, so I'm just asking about schools, whatever. And I walked up to the KIPP table and Quinn and Joe were standing there, and they are both still friends of mine, still doing amazing things. And they started telling me about KIPP, and they were
What does KIPP stand for?
It stands for Knowledge is Power program. So it's a nationwide public charter district. It started in middle schools, and now it's pre-K through KIPP through college. So they support all the way up and down. But at this point, they still only had middle schools. They were still mostly in Houston and New York. And they, are extra in all of the things. So they are extra in how much time they expect kids to be at school, how much support they give, what the expectations are. But largely it's about, your zip code should not be your destiny. So I met the two of them and I was like, oh, so tell me about KIPP. I'm like,
Yeah. What do I care?
and
Like I care.
like
Dazzle
I am-
me.
I am beyond embarrassed and like I cannot believe that this. So
No, it's a good story.
So they started talking about it and they're like, yeah, our kids come to school at 7:25 and they are, there until 4:00. And we are in the South Bronx and we make sure that 5th grade through 8th grade, they're supported and they learn and they grow and they have opportunities at private schools and public schools and that they can go to and graduate from college. And I was like, that's cool. And as we were talking more about it, I found myself like really interested in their mission. And at the end of it, I can remember, not the end, but I can remember saying, I bet that you guys self-select, because people who come up to you and they're like, yay, kids show up to school at 7:25, because they are not Michael Barrett. They know that means that teachers need to get there earlier.
Like 7:24. Yeah, at the
Day
latest.
later. Yeah, so I was just like, wow, you must really self-select your talent, because I'm sure as many teachers walk away from this table as walk towards it. And I think that was part of what made them kind of curious about me, was because I like acknowledged that or whatever. And they said like, hey, do you have a resume? Like, can we talk more? So I
have one resume.
I have one. Here's the one. And I decided to go visit them and observe classes and stuff like that as sort of my own professional development. So I actually went to my principal and said, I want to go see this school that I'm hearing great things about. Can I go see it? And I was floored. And then I was like, oh my God, I want to work here. I can't. Now I had none of the confidence I had.
Yeah.
Please hire me. So that was really interesting. But I tell that story to the kids that I college counseled, because I would tell them to go up to colleges at the college fair, go up to the table of the school that you don't care about and just like chat them up so that you get that like practice.
You get like in the groove, kind of, yeah.
Right. And I was like, I literally, if I had cared as much as I did at that, there is no chance I would have made words make sense. Like, I would have been too like dumbstruck. So I went and I loved it. I was really fortunate that I got an offer. I went there. I got really great support in the summer because the kids start school in the summer. So I got support from the outgoing teacher, the inimitable Mamie Hostetter. And I was really, really fortunate. So I loved it. And then that's when I then went to KIPP through college, and I started to work with kids on their college counseling and their high school where they were, and visited them all over the place.
So at first you were a teacher, like a classroom
Yep.
teacher. And then you became a counselor, specifically coaching them in like a college, like moving. Was it when they were about to leave KIPP and go to college, or even as they were in college, you were still in contact with them?
So even as they were in college, I was still in contact with them. And then there was a period when I was working at KIPP through college that I was the director of high school placement. So we were just starting our high school, had a history of sending kids all over the country for high schools. And so I worked with 8th graders in their application processes for that. And I had a cohort of about 40 kids who were in high school and college. Okay. So I was like counseling those kids and working with the 230 8th graders at the 4 different middle schools to help them with their process. And then I went to just working with college kids who were enrolled in like lots of different colleges, but working mostly with the college kids who were enrolled locally to make sure that they had what they needed to graduate.
Still as part of KIPP?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you said KIPP has, well, here's a related question I want to ask while I'm thinking of it and while we're sort of on topic. You've described all these experiences in the New York City school, environment, which is enormous and complex and everything. Do you know if other large cities tend to have similar things going on, or is a lot of what we've talked about, the details, like kind of specific to New York? I mean, I know you might not know that unless you just lived in those cities and had experience there, but talking to other teachers, do you know if this is like a similar, like the whole school within a school concept? Does that exist like in other big cities, or in what ways might those be different or similar, would you think, in other?
Yeah, I think they're probably similar in places where real estate is at a premium. Because I think, at least in Chicago, I know that there was
like significant population density.
Yeah.
Basically, it starts to be that way. Yeah.
Yes. And also just like, I know that gyms and cafeterias are the central deciding factor in any sort of major scheduling.
Yeah. Okay.
Stuff like that. But I don't know enough about other cities to know if like what the other sort of competing priorities are.
Yeah, I was just curious because New York is kind of an exceptional environment. Yeah, just because of the scale of it and everything. And I wanted to ask too. So I think you mentioned KIPP exists outside of New York, though. There's other schools in other parts of the country. Yeah,
it first started in Houston, in one classroom in Houston, and then one of the co-founders moved back to New York City, and then it just like blew up everywhere. So they're KIPPs all over the country. And it's kind of cool because now it's like pre-K all the way through college. So the kinds of supports that kids needed are no longer as needed, but also the ones that KIPP is having to support in different ways now. Which is really cool.
So you said there's KIPPs all over the country. Does that mean is like the unit like of a KIPP? Is that a whole like physical building where everybody in that building is in KIPP? Like it's a school that's 100% KIPP, or is it a program within a school, or could it be either one, or how does that work?
No, so it's often not by itself in a building, especially not in New York City. So we were on the 4th floor of a building, off 156th Street, and it was our KIPP Academy. The school was only the 4th floor of that building.
But it was like a self-contained school. Like it was everybody who was in that like all day long. That was their whole experience. Yeah. Right.
And that's typically the experience of the, now it's KIPP schools. It's not, KIPP as a program. So now it is each school, but not necessarily like not physically. The buildings are not necessarily exclusively for hipsters.
Yeah. So you mentioned eventually being in a position of kind of counseling kids in college who had been through the KIPP program. And then what happened after that? Were you still with KIPP beyond that? Or is that at some point, it sounds like you were not with them anymore? I don't know if that was the most recent change or
Yeah. So then I moved to Dallas for family and they didn't have a high school here. So the KIPP high school didn't exist here. And I knew I wanted to be on a high school campus. And so I went to Quinn, who featured in the story earlier.
Yep.
And Quinn actually now lived in Dallas at that point, separately for his own reasons, right? And so he was here, and I was like, oh, I think we're going to move there. Like, know anyone? Like,
yeah. So what should I do?
He was trying, so he was encouraging me to consider KIPP, but I was like, I really want to work on a high school campus, and they didn't have one at the time. So he connected me with Uplift Education, which is a network here of public charter schools. So I then interviewed at one of the schools and with their Road to College program. So then I interviewed with the team that did the Road to College stuff, but then I also sort of walked around and talked with people at the campus that I was most interested in, but somebody was already there in that job. And it didn't look like they were leaving. We had no reason to believe that they were leaving. But when I left and I went back to New York, because I was just visiting to like see things and interview, I said, you know, if that job at that school opens up, please consider me, because I loved the community. The school was great. The principal is the bomb. Like, such a great feeling that I knew that if it was a possibility, and it was going to be the founding graduating class of that high school. So I loved, like, okay, I can set how this looks for all the classes behind this group. And like, I know what it's like to work with founders, because I did that at the KIPP high school. So I was very lucky that the woman who had my job decided to go to grad school that year. It just seems to be a thing. Like, if you're going to grad school, let me know.
Yeah.
And so I got a call from Amy at Uplift, and she was like, you know, this opportunity's opened up. And then I started there, and that's when I was the dean of college prep. So I coached teachers, but I also just worked with all the kids and supported them on their college stuff.
Just so I'm understanding, after moving to Dallas, did you get the one job first and then end up moving to the other one when the person went to grad school? Or was the timing such that you went straight into the person who went to grad school?
I just went straight into, I wasn't applying for a specific role. I was just like applying and getting to know them. And then that specific role opened up. Yeah.
And so that was not at any point a classroom teaching role. That was a guidance-y sort of.
Yes. So, and you know what? Can I back up? Because I missed this whole thing where I worked for 3 years at the KIPP high school. I didn't remember that.
Tell us
okay.
Okay.
So I was working at KTC, KIPP through college. Then the high school opened. For the first couple of years that the high school opened, I was
was in New York City still?
In New York City, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I was still working for KTC. The high school opened, and it's like this beautiful building, and all of my babies from 8th grade were about to graduate from high school. They were all rising juniors. And I was like, I want to be there with them, like, for this. And so I was one of the founding college counselors based out of the KIPP high school for a few years. And I worked with that founding class, which was my last group of 8th graders at the middle school. And I then picked up the junior college career readiness class. So that's when I was like doing SAT prep for 200 kids. That was fun. And then I moved. So I had that experience like on the campus, and I really loved being back on a campus. And so then when I moved into administration, I wanted to be on a campus.
That was like why you had that idea in mind, was getting back to that environment. Yeah.
Yeah. So and then I got to get a taste of administration. So I worked with our donors. I worked with colleges. I worked with outside organizations and nonprofits and stuff that were supporting our kids. And that was kind of a taste of things. And I asked if I could just coach the entire English team because I had the English background, and the bomb principal said yes. And so
you're talking about coaching the English teachers?
The teachers themselves.
Yeah.
Yep. All the 9th through 12th grade teachers. And I kept just coaching teachers and managing my team. I think I had 5 full-time folks on my team, just an amazing group of humans. And we just helped another amazing group of younger humans.
Humans helping humans.
All the humans.
Nice thing to see.
The best.
Yeah.
So we just helped them with their college applications, and then we supported them and helped them while they were in school, or if they wanted to transfer, or that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So it's interesting that, you mentioned, I think at the beginning, that you've had 19 years in education, and it seems like only mostly near the beginning were you doing something that most people who aren't in the workforce yet would think of as education, which is like physically standing in the classroom, teaching an academic subject to kids. It seems like a lot of what you've done has been like academic advice to kids as far as like what moves to make in their academic careers, and then coaching teachers on like how they should teach people, like kind of a step removed, but like higher up hierarchically or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. So do you feel like that was just kind of the opportunities that presented themselves, or do you feel like that's a better fit for you? Like, are you happier there, or do you sometimes think I'd like to be like just in a classroom in a more, in that kind of a role? Like, how do you feel about that shift, I guess?
So I have a whisper goal.
Sorry, can you because I feel like I've heard that term at educational conferences, and I don't think
I think you heard it from Shirin, because I only ever heard it from her. The moment she said that, I was like, oh, Shirin said that when we were in South by Southwest. And I was like, whisper goal.
Is that
Immediately know what it means. But
did you make up that term, or is that a term from somewhere else?
I am not smart enough I do not think I made that term up.
You're the only person I've ever heard say it. So as far as I'm concerned, it's an original.
I'm going to go ahead and say
I've heard it from somewhere, but I don't know where. But I want to retire teaching an English elective class, probably at the high school level, with a syllabus exclusively of kids that I've worked with, their published works. Like, this is the thing that I would love to do.
Whoa. Huh.
Yeah. So I've gotten a couple kids who are, already on the syllabus.
Yeah.
So I would love to do that. I would love to go back to the classroom. For right now, I like this work because I like the being able to zoom in and out, and being able to understand the granular, but then also being able to say
affect
big picture.
Things at the big picture. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
That's really cool. And then I also think that there's this, I like that I used to be able to, my son was not yet born when I was still in the classroom, but I would say I'm a teacher, and he understood I'm a teacher. He's now 8, and he's like, so what's your job? And I'm like,
yeah, what do you do?
I think that's where the doctor lawyer thing comes up, right? There's a handful of professions that people know what they do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in education, that is a teacher.
Yeah.
So, maybe a principal.
Yeah.
So I think I would like to go back to the classroom at some point, but that's I don't know, down the line.
Kind of like there's things you feel like you'd like to accomplish before you go back to the classroom, sort of like at this more zoomed out level that you're talking about.
Yeah. I kind of feel like there's a reason why I got to visit so many kids at so many high schools and colleges all over the country. And I want to use that experience. And I think there's a reason that I've seen kids, from 14 years old until they're 30, use that knowledge and information differently. So there's a part of me that just kind of feels like it could be a really great way of leveraging the opportunities that I've had. Not for personal gain or whatever.
Yeah, but make the most of those insights in some way that's helpful, contribute something. Yeah.
And being incredibly acutely aware that most most don't get that. They often don't get to step outside of their own classroom and see other teachers teaching. So there's that component of it too.
one thing that a lot of people, approach us for is help with obviously standardized testing, but also just college related things and increasingly just other stuff kind of around that, picking majors, picking schools, that kind of thing. So it strikes me that you have a tremendous wealth of experience and observations related to that. And I'm wondering, I know this is kind of a weird way to phrase this question, but hopefully like this initial question might lead to like further discussion. Is there any sort of blanket advice that you think you can give that needs to be given? Like, is there anything that you consistently see people paying too much attention to when they shouldn't, or they're not paying enough attention when they should, or nothing? Or is it one of those it depends moments? Like, what do you think about all that?
It depends. I don't know if there's like one thing. I think there's the piece of like being open to things not being what you expect them to be, and you not being who you plan to be, or who you think you're planning to be.
Yeah. This always, there's a study that I read a while ago, or I can't remember if I read it or I read about it, but either way. And it made a really interesting point. It was through whatever way the study chose to measure personality. It measured people's personalities when they were, I think, either late teens, early 20s, somewhere in there. And then again, those who had survived to be like 70 or 80 and measured them, at that point. And they may have done it every 10 years or something. I honestly can't remember. But the big takeaway was there was no correlation between what people were like at the end of the study and the beginning, even to the point that like, if you just gave someone a set of profiles, like all the profiles of the younger people and all the profiles of the older people, and said like, try to pick like which young person became which old person. Nope. Yeah. You just couldn't match it up at all. And, looking back on my own life, I've been at least 3 people since I was in high school, and it sounds like you would say something, kind of similar to the way you were describing, like, I can't believe high school me was so hung up on like Georgetown versus whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you try to counsel kids to think, about that? Can you even, how does any of that inform your?
So I try really hard to just give them what I know from the large number of kids in their relative age range that I've worked with. So, a lot of kids, the vast majority of kids change their majors. And there's probably no good reason to tell not a child, but like an adult, actually, an 18-year-old.
Right.
Hey, you might not end up doing that. So, does this have other things that you want to do? Like, that's not only is that not productive, it's not particularly helpful to them. Like, it's just not useful. So I try to think of it as like, I just share with them, a lot of kids I've worked with have changed their majors at some point. So one thing that seems to happen is when they change their majors, they do it maybe somewhere in their sophomore year. So are there enough things at this school that you're curious about, interested in, whether it's clubs, athletics, whatever. Are there enough things that you're interested in that you can continue to like sort of grow your world so that if you do change your mind, that you've like sort of built some sort of a network there, established a community, and then you can kind of change gears either there or somewhere else. But now more people know you, so you might be more able to get that recommendation letter from professors. You might be able to name an accomplishment or two, whatever it is, right? So that you stand out in a transfer application or whatever. So that is one thing that, I just try to give them some sense of, I'm not like an expert on anybody's path, but having worked with a lot of kids in various stages of this particular place in their life, I feel a little bit more knowledgeable about trends And I think kids appreciate understanding what happens a lot. What do a lot of kids say about this school or whatever, you know?
Yeah. Am I weird for feeling this
Right.
way or for not knowing, or did I screw up in a way that nobody else does? And
Right.
in reality, no, you screwed up in the way everybody screws up.
Everybody.
And,
Like,
that is fine. Yeah.
and that, you know, there's a sense of comfort in like having something that's shared across a lot of different people, but it's also not, as a result, then your thoughts and your plans aren't assessed or judged on their own. I'm not in a position to like say, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. I will never,
Sure. Yeah.
you know, like, well, this way is more expensive than this way.
Yeah. And it's your call on whether or not that's something you might want to think about.
I like the loans aren't going in my name. And I'll tell you, like, if it were up to me, if my stepdad hadn't been crying on the couch and saying, we can't do this, if it was me taking out however many tens of thousands of dollars in loans, I probably would have. And that would have changed things for me. And that's usually the conversation that I have with kids is like, this is going to be in your name. Right? Both the diploma and the debt are in your name.
Yeah.
And like, I loved the flexibility of doing what I wanted to do, but that came at a cost of not being able to go where I wanted to go 4 years earlier. So I don't know, like, it's not blanket advice so much as it is like understanding the trade-offs.
Sure.
That's the only thing that I really try to emphasize when I'm working with kids.
I think for a lot of the people that we talk to, I say this a lot in various ways, but the college admissions process is probably the first just blatantly, profoundly unfair thing that they go through. And I don't even mean that it's unfair. Like, it's not even trying to be fair. Like, you think when you're the applicant that there's some kind of fairness involved or something. And the institutions have their own reasons for doing what they do. It's not that it's like arbitrary necessarily, but I think a lot of people think, I know I certainly thought like, okay, I have these kinds of grades, these kinds of numbers and stats, these kinds of activities. I worked this hard to do this kind of thing. And now I'm going to apply here. And if I'm one of the like better people, then they're going to let me in. And if I'm not, then they won't. But that isn't it at all. You know, they're not like ranking everyone based on what numbers they have. And then they pick and even if they were, whatever, it's a whole separate thing. But I like that what you're saying is sort of acknowledging that you're kind of, when you go into college, you're leaving behind a more or less structured kind of thing. Like, you have to take from a choice of these classes this semester, and then these classes and these classes, and so many years of a foreign language and so many years of math or whatever it is. And, you know what options are in front of you, what options are in front of your classmates, et cetera. And you kind of leave that and you go into this process that's not anything like that at all.
Yeah.
And
it starts to be more just like, well, there's a lot of stuff you could do. And
right.
to a certain extent, we're going to tell you what's required. But beyond that, I mean, you could even just leave this entire place if you want to. You know, it's just not an option in high school, really. I mean, for most people, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that you're, and I, looking back, should have expected that your answer would be thoughtful in that kind of way. But I like that it's good. Like, I would agree. Like, that is something that, those are the types of things that students have to be thinking about. And you really can't like tell them what they should do. Not that I don't mean like, I mean that you don't know what they should do. You know, like it's nobody, it's not like a known fact. Like you can, mathematically find the area of a square or something. Like you don't know in that kind of sense, this person should go down this path with these schools and then do this kind of job at the end. And that's going to be perfect for you. Like you don't know that. Right. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, yes, I do not know that. I think about the college process for kids. It's like a mystery. It comes down to things like the SAT and the way that it's scored, the ACT and the way that it's scored. It's not designed to be like super simple for like intuitive. Nothing about this process is intuitive, right? So if you start there and then students at the schools where I've been or organizations that I've been that have had the benefit of having a separate college counselor, because keep in mind, like in Texas, the average counselor to student ratio is 1 to, I think it was 452.
Patrick and I were just talking about that the other day. Like, that's insane. How can you counsel 452 people? Anyway, sorry.
You can't, right? You can't. So what you end up doing is you end up being the person responsible for schedule changes, right? And then you're like when there's a red flag or a trauma or something like that, you get called in. But as a result, you have a lot of kids who kind of stumble through the process and, might have been a little bit like me, where hopefully if their friends are signing up for the SAT and they're talking about, oh, I need to prepare and blah, 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 like they might stumble into that decision to do that as well. But in the places that I have worked, apart from the first couple schools that I worked at, those college counselors, the value that they bring is really just kind of like awareness and context, right? Like kids are being contextualized every step of the process. And the only part of the context they don't understand is the context of the other applicants.
Which is huge. Yeah.
And like, God, I've had as many conversations with kids about you were perfectly qualified and eligible to be accepted at this school, but they are trying, especially smaller schools that actually have the financial aid to give to students that I've worked with, but they are trying to create an orchestra and they need a tuba player and you don't play the tuba. Like that's like, that is
sometimes literally that's what it is, but even like
metaphorically, but sometimes actually.
But this is the kind of thing that I'm like, this is why, the clear line is such a damaging narrative to give to kids because it's not true. Like you could have gotten all of the right grades and done all of the right extracurricular activity, whatever it is, and still not have the opportunity at the end. And for a lot of students that I've worked with, that's been a function of access, social capital, financial means. They just don't have the same access to all of the different parts. But yeah, college is so weird. I mean, that whole varsity blues thing, the thing that struck me about that was not that it happened or that they got caught. I was like, I mean, there are names of people on buildings for this. That is the way that people buy access to colleges.
Right.
Legally.
I have to say, very cynically, I was amazed that anyone was amazed by it. Like, I was like, what did you think was happening? Not that I don't mean to say that every single person who's accepted to any school was doing something like that. That's not what I mean at all.
Right. Of course. And I think that there's like this component for me where in working with kids, so I've worked largely with underrepresented minorities, largely with lower income students and families. And that imposter syndrome thing that happens, that is so real and so pervasive. Like I can count on it. I can count on it when I've worked with a kid through the process and they've landed at a PWI and they have whatever experience. I can count on the fact that they'll come home over Thanksgiving or Christmas and say, so Miss Foroudi, this thing happened. Or I don't know, maybe I should just go back to like the state, like that process is so predictable. It's sad. Like, and I'm like, oh my God, that's still happening. Like I've been doing this for a very long time. How is that still happening? But like in a lot of ways, I think that happens professionally. That happens at the adult level. Like that still happens even when they're 30 and they get an opportunity and they're like, well, I don't know. How do I negotiate for the number of kids I've worked with as grownups who are talking about salary and I'm like, I don't know. I never negotiate. I don't know how to do this. But yeah, those kinds of things are really interesting to me. And it's been really nice to see some movement, like see more kids get sort of more opportunities and move on to contribute and encourage other kids to go the same way. So
I don't know what kind of answer I was hoping for, but that was a really good answer. Thank you.
Yeah,
it worked out for me.
I think for me, that's, if we had like a full, 24 hours to speak to you, I'm sure I could fill it up. But in terms of
Get a second wind or a third.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that covered all the.
But yeah, I feel like you were extremely helpful and open, and am very confident that a lot of people will have benefited from listening to you. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for your time and your insight and expertise.
You're very kind.
And best of luck in your new role.
Thank you again to Shirin for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it. I think we covered a lot of really important ideas there. One theme that I feel the need to stress, because I feel like it clashes very much with the way most high schoolers and college students see the post-education world or post-formal education world for them. One of the themes was just people in charge not really knowing what to do, not because they were like underqualified or anything, just because that's the nature of what you're doing. I mean, a great example is this pandemic hit, and who could have been prepared for that? I mean, obviously there are some people whose job is specifically that, but in, the quote unquote normal people who aren't thinking of such things, who would have thought a couple of years ago this is a thing they would have had to adapt to? And she described, all these school districts are doing all these different things and having a hard time kind of communicating with each other. Probably we didn't really get into the why so much, but some amount of it was probably just, who knows if what I'm doing is right, so why would I let everybody else know what that is? And also you're just working so hard to get through each day, how do you stop and have a meeting with a bunch of other schools and figure it out? It's just the sort of, you got to adapt to the situation.
Yeah, I was going to say, from the things that I was hearing, I think the latter possible reason that you just put forward, I think accounts for a lot of it, because the staffs of all these different schools, the administrators, they weren't only having to figure this problem out for the school, but then they were also having to deal with who's going to watch my kid, while
their own actual lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And what if my relatives get sick or I get sick, or, so, it put such a giant wrench into every aspect of life.
Everything.
Really. Right. And so the administrators that we've kind of been speaking to throughout all of this, universally, they have just seemed overworked, for lack of a better word. And it's not because they're not working extremely hard, like they are. There's just so much that needs to be figured out. And like you said, people were so taken aback, caught off guard by it that it just led to a mass chaos. Something along the lines of what you were describing, though, too, this idea of the people in charge not maybe always being super competent. That's not just in education, and I don't think it's totally the case in any field. I think we, meaning you and I, Patrick, we often come across, or we may sometimes come across, with a very iconoclastic sort of anti-establishment, kind of vibe. And that's on purpose.
I do like the classed icons.
Yeah, that is generally how I truly feel, but I don't want to
Right. A lot of that is pretty legitimate.
Yeah. And part of it is in evidence with the response to this pandemic. It would be incorrect, I think, to say that on any level, any group, anywhere on earth did a really good job dealing with this. Well, I mean, I'm sure someone somewhere did, but it would not be correct to say that the entire human race,
there's plenty of exampes
as one, right, could point to its leadership in every case and say, well, all of you guys did a really good job with this. But while all of that is true, I want to make it very clear, there are certainly competent people in positions of leadership and authority. There are good decisions that get made. There are beneficial institutions that exist in society. All of society would not exist in any way if no one were ever competent at anything. So, the fact that we have interstates and the internet,
anything that functions.
Right. The fact that there's anything functioning means obviously people are doing at least okay in a lot of areas. So I don't want to make it sound like that never happens. But what I would like to say, what we have said, and I want to say it again now, is there's an idea that I think a lot of high school and college students had. I know I had it, maybe not even without realizing it. Maybe I had it without realizing it, but you just sort of assume that when you finish being educated, you'll go out into a world where everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone has a job. They do the job.
And things make sense.
Things make sense. Right. And to a large extent, it doesn't end up being that way. And I think we're just trying to, like, correct me if this isn't how you see it, but we're just trying to like cushion the blow. We're trying to get people to realize, like, you're going to go out there and it's not necessarily going to be that you know what your life will be like in 6 months or a year or 10 years, in the way that when you were like 10, you had a pretty good idea what your life would be like when you were 15. When you're 20, you don't have the same concept, probably for most people, of what your life will be like when you're 25. It's not as predictable at that point anymore.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And another aspect of it is, I think so many, it's a funny thing because the people who thrive on the structure of high school and college then often end up being the ones, who are kind of like quote unquote overachievers in school, who feel very uncomfortable in the non-school world where, as you said, there isn't that kind of structure. And a lot of people, I think, sort of hesitate on the sidelines or aim lower than they need to because they don't feel the kind of certainty about walking into a certain field or a meeting or an interview or whatever, because it's not like the way it was in high school where I can know what I have to read ahead of time, or I can know what the teacher's going to ask or whatever. It's not like that. And so they think, oh, like there must be something wrong with me at this point, because normally I would be able to know everything that I needed to know ahead of time. But now when I go into this job interview, I don't know what they're going to do. And also, another recurring idea is in school, it's not the case in school that you can go take a history test today, get an F, find a different history class online, go there tomorrow, take another test to see if you do better, whereas in the job market, you can go to a job interview today, absolutely bomb it, totally just a horrible, embarrassing, you offend them accidentally, it can go really, really badly, but then you can find another job listing in a week or a day or whatever later that same day, and have learn from what you just did and do a better job. So there's a sort of not infinite, but almost infinite chance for more opportunities or whatever, as opposed to the school model where it's like, oh, well, you screwed up your science project. You can't just do another one usually,
right.
Or do
now this more. Goes on your transcript and you can worry about
it. Exactly. So I think so we definitely, that's a core reason I think that we do try to point this out. It's like, look, nobody feels super confident, and even aside from the pandemic thing, Shirin kept mentioning, I applied for this education job. I didn't feel qualified. I think part of it is she's modest and she was qualified, but for a lot of stuff, or at least a big part of the qualification was really just the drive to see it through, do it right, do right by your students, which she clearly had. And I'm sure her employers and prospective employers saw that. But even before the pandemic, she described a lot of not like outright chaos, but people not being sure what to do. Like, we live in a world that is changing at such an unbelievable rate, and 50 years ago, there was nothing like that going on. I mean, it was changing then, but it's only increased, and 20 years ago and 10 years ago. And if you've been a teacher for 20 years, you're trying to keep up to date with what's happening in the world. So education is always changing. People are, thinking of new models for schools within schools, as we talked about. So there's just, and we're talking about education, but if you're talking about going into whatever field and you have that uncertainty, it doesn't mean that like you can't find a place to get started. That's kind of how a lot of things are. So as you said, this is why we tend to point this out, not because nothing works and everybody's dumb and nobody's competent, just because that feeling of uncertainty that you maybe didn't have so much in your education, that is a big part of just about anything, in the post-education.
And conversely, if you have felt pretty uncertain about most stuff during your education, good news, in a way, you've been trained.
Yeah, exactly. You've got a lot of practice. Yeah,
boy,
exactly.
Are you going to feel right at home?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so comfortable with this sense of being completely uncomfortable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So one other thing, kind of to your point, and this really is, I think, symptomatic of a general issue across the education system in America and probably in a lot of other places as well. But when Shirin was describing being in that master's level class on educational technology and learning about
access.
Yeah, there was no technology in the room. So that's an example of how like the real world often goes. I'm sure that whoever put that course together and whoever decided that the students, the master's level students, should take that course, I'm sure that person knew a lot about using technology in school systems. I'm sure that they had a very good reason for putting it in the curriculum based on.
Well, they were likely told by someone else, this needs to be in here,
Right. Absolutely. Like I'm making it sound like it was one person decided that. I'm sure it was not.
Yeah.
It was decided by, but the thought process that went into including that course, I'm sure was motivated by good experience, good intention.
And grounded in something.
But the practical reality of the people who were actually sitting in the room taking the course was that it was just a complete swing and a miss.
Yeah, they're far removed from whatever process created it, as you described.
Right. So that's one part of what's interesting about that story to me. And another very significant part of it is just the very, very different levels of technological access that exist like across different school districts. We're not really going to say anything, I'm sure, right now that's like a new way to solve this problem or a new insight on it. But it is a real thing, and if you are lucky enough to have access to good usable technology in your classrooms, and you're lucky enough to be given projects that sort of require you to learn things like coding or just interfacing with machines in any kind of way, that's good. Like you're very lucky to have that.
One thing I was thinking when you said the class they learned about how to use technology in the classroom, she was like, not only are we learning that, we're not learning what we do need to learn, which is like, how do you write a lesson plan? She was so glad that one of the people in the class raised their hand and said that. And that's just goes back to what we were saying. There's these organizations are these giant, like sprawling things, and it's very easy for stuff to get overlooked. And, wow, you never ever learned this thing that we just assumed everybody would learn,
right.
And it just comes up when you actually start doing it. And she even said also, she needed to learn, she as a teacher and a counselor and her peers needed to learn a lot more about like communication with their students and interpersonal stuff, sort of like geared toward people in their situation of their students. And they didn't really, it just becomes like an on the job thing. And
well, what that kind of reminded me of too, when we interviewed David, Dr.
I was just thinking that exact same thing.
He said exactly the same. Like no one taught us how to sit in a room with a family of a dying patient and like, you just kind of do it a few times and hopefully get better at it. Yeah. I'm sure he's good at it, but there's got to be people who are that great at it. And it's the kind of thing that you would think would really help. Also, what it also kind of speaks to in Shirin's case, not just Shirin, but in the field of education, because she's not the only person that I've heard, say those kinds of things. I think that like sort of on a systemic level, the field of pedagogy, like the field of how you train a teacher to be a teacher, for a long time, at least in our system, it overlooked the idea that the student was anything but this like passive sponge that was just going to like, if you teach them how to do this, they're going to know how to do that,
It's definitely one of those things that has been done a certain way for so long that it's hard to even stop and try to rethink all of it, in the context of a much different world.
Exactly. And society has changed so much and whatever. So for Shirin to like have to deal with that, I mean, for one thing, it speaks to her as a person and how readily and willingly, she dove into that world and said like, okay, how can I serve these kids? Like when she was saying, okay, so I just realized all these kids are going to graduate from our program and they're going to go to all these different places. Like, shouldn't someone be keeping track of what happens to them? Like, don't we need to know that?
Matter?
I mean, I imagine
feels like that matters,
right? And so she, as a person, is certainly very willing to actually invest energy into that and find out about it. And I know obviously a lot of educators are similar in that kind of way. That's one of the reasons why people go into the field, is because they are genuinely interested in that. But on the training level, like it really would feel like a good idea to me. If anyone's listening to this who does any kind of teacher training, I would say that sounds like something that you should be thinking about.
Yeah, well, that feeds into what we were saying before about just the fast-paced changing world. I mean, on one level, it's intuitive in most situations to think, well, the trainers should be people with decades of experience. Well, if those people have been teaching for 40 years, then the world they went into when they started teaching isn't anywhere close to the current world, which doesn't mean that they can't be good at their job. But there's sort of a built-in contradiction there where it's like, well, that expertise is very valuable, but it's also needs to be connected to the current situation. So, I mean, it's understandable that it would be hard to find that sweet spot of let's make the most of this very valuable, expertise and time in the classroom, there are lots of aspects of that are going to be the same. And then there are other ones that have changed or maybe need to change. So I guess I don't want to make it sound like, oh, this is such an easy problem to solve. Like, why doesn't someone just do it? I want that to be very clear. Right. It's more just we're describing these are the challenges. And it's not surprising that it ends up, having some of these issues.
That adds something else too to what we were saying at the very beginning of this analysis about how, in the adult world, stuff is often a lot less structured and a lot less clear in terms of what you should be doing next.
Yeah.
Part of the problem is, a big part of the problem is what we just described. Like, when you're in school, most of the problems that are set before you have been solved already, and your job is to find the solution.
Or they're presented like they've been solved.
Sure. Yeah.
The way you see them is they've been solved.
Right. Like, no one asks you to come up with a way to find the area of a triangle. But, when you become an adult and you're out there, you start to deal with problems that no one has solved yet. No one has solved this problem of how do you train teachers in the most effective way. And part of the reason they haven't solved it is all the things we've been talking about. And there's a million things more that have also not been, figured out for that. And many other problems, are out there, obviously. So that is also, again, a big part of why the adult world often feels less certain and more chaotic. It's because it is like you're closer to the edge of.
Yeah. And it's not a deficiency on your part, you being a high school student or a college student trying to enter it. It's not that every other high schooler and college student and whoever feels like they know just what's going on. That's not the case. It's the case that everybody feels a little bit like, what is going on here? Or why does this seem so disorganized or opaque or whatever? And it's because there's a bunch of fires to put out. There's a bunch of issues people are working on.
In some cases, literal fires.
And you are now going to be one of those people. Yeah, exactly. Who is trying to solve these problems. Now, I do want to, because it's interesting, the nature of Shirin's work is such that we ended up kind of talking about a lot of stuff that's directly tied to what we're kind of usually getting at, which is like the education stuff and kind of planning as you enter careers, because that's what she helps people do as well. I do also want to talk about like her own journey, which we haven't really gotten into yet.
Yeah. There's one thing that really struck me about her story. And I think, obviously, Shirin and I have known each other for a long time. I think I may have already heard this story before we spoke for this talk. But either way, I was struck freshly by it this time. The thing about how her stepdad was reduced to tears because...
Yeah, that was...
Yeah, well, and maybe this is why it struck me differently now. Like when I heard that, or if I imagine hearing it when I'm a student.
When you heard it.
Yeah, like my sympathy would be with the student, and it still is. I mean, that's a very difficult thing for any student to go through. But now that I'm a bit older and I've seen so many families go through this process, it's just so heartbreaking and human to imagine yourself as the parent, wanting to provide, having given your word that this would be a thing that you could do. And then you find out that you just can't. And every negative emotion you can think of would potentially be what you're feeling. And to the point that this was clearly a big thing for him, as Shirin said, like he never cried.
Yeah.
He was crying about this.
Only ever saw him, cry in this situation. Yeah.
And I just want to say, for anyone who may not be aware of this and anybody in that high school, college age range who may not realize it, it's a big deal for the parents too. And I don't mean that I think the student should make decisions solely to please the parent or not, or like, I'm not saying anything about any of that. It's just when I went through it, I remember feeling like I was just going through it and my parents were just sort of watching. Now looking back, obviously they had their hearts in their throats the whole time.
Just like you thought that teachers didn't really exist outside of school.
Yeah.
I just assumed like standard adult rules, like they're not doing anything.
One of the big lessons
when I'm not seeing them. One of them go to a casino or something.
Oh, and something else before I forget. So Shirin mentioned that, part of the issue for her was that she had filled out the FAFSA incorrectly. And I know that is the FAFSA and the CSS are like a huge, people don't like filling them out, and it's a big stressful thing every time you have to do it. If you do it wrong, if you make a mistake, there are ways to fix it. I don't know what the path would have been at the time that Shirin went through this. By her, description of it, I think they maybe weren't super, up on all the ins and outs of the process. And why would you be? Like, especially pre-internet, like pre-Facebook groups about it, like pre all of that. Yeah. There was just, if your guidance counselor wasn't bending over backwards to help you with it, there was really no other way to find out. So anyway, if you're listening to this and you're like worried that you're going to make a mistake on your FAFSA when the time comes and it's going to result in some awful outcome, those mistakes can be corrected once you catch them. My understanding is that it then will delay, like, the final result you get as the process plays out. But it's something that's been coming up in a lot of the various online groups, which are not always so helpful, but in this respect, they have at least seemed pretty helpful to people, especially because of the pandemic and the various economic impacts of all those things. There's been a lot of parents saying, hey, when I filled this information out, it was correct and it's not correct anymore. Now what do I do? There is a path for fixing that. So
there's something you can do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't want people listening to this to be like, oh no, like that makes it even more important that I don't mess it up. You should try not to mess it up for sure. But if you do, it's not if
you realize that you have made a mistake.
Yeah.
And then it was really, I don't know if telling is the word, instructive or something for our listeners in that, late teens, early 20s age range, to hear Shirin like kind of remembering her mindset at that time. And then like for the couple of years after that of like, I can't believe I was that person, that she was so bitter about going to UF and so bitter about Georgetown not happening. And you could just hear her like, you might not, our listeners, you might not have that big of a turnaround, or you might have a bigger one, but for sure, something that you feel like is super important right now, you're going to have a completely different perspective on it at some point. And she said, being at UF, she was able to be close with her family geographically during this really hard time of her stepdad being sick, which, she couldn't have predicted or planned for that, but it was a good thing, that she was able to be closer. And then she said, like, not having all this debt totally changed her options in a really good way. She would have had so much more debt at Georgetown in her situation, and going to UF made that not the case. So she had a lot more flexibility and more freedom. She mentioned what she had in her bank account when she graduated, but she would have had negative way more than that, if she did somewhere else. Well, there was urgency for her to get a job, but what that job was more flexible, because there are certain jobs you could get and they would just cover your loan payment. And then that doesn't give you any money for, rent or food or the stuff that you have to do.
And to be clear, just in case you're wondering, if you've never looked at a bank account, like the loan amount that you owe is not written as a negative number on your bank account.
Yeah,
so it wouldn't have actually.
I just meant like the whole net worth that you would have.
Your
at
general
that
sense
would
of
be,
right.
quite negative.
And there are people who are happy that they took on college debt, and then but most of them are not. Just statistically, there's a lot of surveys, right? So I don't want us to say that no one should ever do it. There are certain circumstances where you might decide that it's good for you, and then you might go on to be happy that you did it. One of the most like impactful statements or whatever that I ever heard at like an educational conference kind of a thing was, Patrick, I think you were there with me when we saw this. And I think Shirin was too, actually. I think we went to a startup pitch kind of event at the South by Southwest EDU, like last time that it happened. And there was a pitch for, I can't remember the website, but it was a website that helped people minimize college loans in various ways. Yeah. And the stat was like based on some kind of survey, and it said something like, I'm going to say a giant number because I can't remember. I'll say 100 billion. It wasn't actually that, but I'm deliberately saying like a huge number. It was like $100 billion of student debt are regretted every year.
What a funny way to, I remember say that.
And I remember that word regret. And I mean,
the regret is clinically measurable.
Right. Yeah. They did surveys of people who had, college and said, do you regret it?
Oh, are you glad you did that?
Said yes. Right. No. So, I mean, that's how they measured it. It's kind of a sort of a sneaky way to validate saying that. But it is undoubtedly true. I mean, if you go on various like financial planning groups and forums now, whenever the topic of school debt comes up, there are some people who say, I'm really glad I did it. It changed my life in a positive way. The overwhelming majority of people say, if I could go back and not do that, I would go back and not do that.
Yeah. And in Shirin's case, it's more stark because she specifically had such strong feelings when she was entering college, that like, as she said, that she had earned this other spot in this other place, and that's where she should be, and she was just so, as she put, salty about it, you know what I mean? And then to to go through that experience and then look back on herself then and go, oh man, like I was so wrong, like for, as you said, this is not true for every single person. It's true for a lot of people, and it was just very true for her. And it was interesting just to hear in her voice, like the perspective shift when looking back. There's sometimes, you don't really remember how you used to feel about something until you take a moment and it kind of hits you because of the conversation you're having or something. You go, oh, wow, I used to really like this thing or want that.
Right.
That made no sense, and to kind of observe that was interesting.
Well, and that's actually another sort of an example within an example of how people change over time and how their understanding of a situation changes over time. So on the one hand, as Shirin said at the time, as we're saying now, like she feels herself to be a totally different person. I myself also, by the way, not that anyone's asking, but I feel myself to be a totally different person from who I was then. So that's one aspect of it, but also like very, in a more subtle way, the sentiment of, oh, I earned this spot at this better school. I feel confident, like I'm not putting words in her mouth. She would say this, I'm pretty sure. Now she wouldn't feel A, that the school's necessarily better, and B, that spots are earned in the admissions process, as she described. And
not the way you feel like they are.
Right. Yeah. It's like what she was saying about the orchestra. Like you might be an incredible applicant and you're just not what they're looking for this year. And that's
wrong
the way
place,
it is.
wrong time. And that's
right.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things people kind of wave their hands about when they're going through the process, and they're like, "Oh, I know that," but I'm sure they're gonna like, no, it's a real thing. Like, it really is real.
Like, don't say you know it. If you know it, you wouldn't be doing any of the stuff you're doing.
Right?
I know it, but not in a way that affects my life or decisions.
Right? Exactly.
Then you don't know it.
So just that whole sentence, like I earned a better spot. I think the only word, because it's not like the I is not the same Shirin anymore. The earn is not something she agrees with. Better is not something it would just be the word spot. Like that's the only part of the sentence.
There was a spot. Yeah. That can't be argued with.
And I do believe this very strongly, what we're talking about, but whenever I say this kind of thing, like there's a part of me that censors myself in the back of my head to be like, well, is that exactly what you mean in every case? And I want to say, there are certainly people who work extremely hard for a chance to be admitted to a top school.
Oh yeah, there's a connection there, but there's
absolutely there's all kinds of strategies you can employ to like dramatically raise your chances of getting in if that's the kind of thing you want to do. And so there is a sense in which you could say that someone worked very hard with that goal according to a plan, and then they achieved it. And if you want to call that earning a spot,
the plan can work out, but it can also just not work out for reasons that you couldn't do anything about.
Right, exactly. But the idea that the people who are admitted are all quantifiably better than the people who were not admitted. Like that idea that's totally not
definitely
true.
False.
It's ridiculous. I mean, it makes me angry that anyone believes it. Like that's not true at all. It could be true that someone could do something that you could reasonably describe as earning a spot or working hard for a spot. Absolutely. But again,
or you could pick any individual kid who got in and describe them as in some particular way being more qualified or whatever.
Sure.
And
say that they
didn't get in on a one-to-one basis, but to make a group judgment or whatever, or to have the assumption of, well, I didn't get in, so I must have in some way failed. Like, absolutely not. I mean, that's not necessarily the case. You could have done everything right, given what you could have possibly known.
I saw a post today, actually. A mother was talking about her son's experience applying to a particular selective school. And she was like listing the stats that he had and his activities and stuff, and saying the admission situation is so messed up by COVID this year. That's so infuriating. Like, he had all these stats. He applied to this school. He didn't get accepted.
That's not a COVID problem.
Right. I mean, COVID made it dramatically worse.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But that dynamic is.
Well, even in any given year, just from what she described as his, stats, not just stats, but I mean, like what she described as his whole package, I would have put his odds of getting into that particular school at less than 1 in 10. But this year it was probably less than 1 in 20 or less than 1 in 50. So, it was dramatically worse odds, but even on the best year, the odds were always against
the general situation is
that applicant. Yeah. And it's I hope it's very clear, like we're not happy that that's the way it is, or we're not like, well, we're laughing about
it's
it.
It's
one of those things.
A misconception. Yeah.
Right. And it's so heartbreaking in a sense to watch so many families go through that whole like beauty pageant process every year.
Oh yeah. not knowing what the actual reality is. It's
and this
hard.
is why. Sorry, just one extra plug. I mentioned I mean, it's not a plug for anything that connects to us at all, but a plug for somebody else who I don't know. I mentioned it when we were talking to Shirin too. There's that book, Who Gets In and Why. And I'm so glad that book was written. I was actually thinking that you and I should try to write a similar kind of book at some point. Now we don't have to because someone already did it. He did a really good job. It really, really helps pull back the curtain, on a lot of what the decision-making process is. And also really points out or it doesn't point out, but it shows that the admissions offices themselves are kind of making it up as they go along in a way. I mean, they have institutional goals. They have their own
They're
ethics.
Competing against other institutions. They have their bosses.
Right. And they really do. And the few that I know, it's really true of them. Like they do want to do the best job they possibly can, but their job inherently means that they have to tell, in some cases, 90% or more of the applicants, nope, sorry, can't come here. And you can try to rationalize that.
Some of whom have worked for, 10 years to do this one thing, giving it their all.
Right. Yeah. Who would also be an incredible student if they were admitted and they know it. And
if there was just a whole second one of those universities, you could fill it with all these people and it would be just like the other one.
Right. It would be just like the other one. And there would still be enough students to build.
To have another couple more of them. It's just physically there's only so many
and
seats.
So I highly, highly, highly recommend that book if you are at all curious to know how the process goes.
That was 3 highlies for people who are counting.
Highly. Yeah, I'll go 10 highlies. I'm not going to say them
10
all.
Highlies. Don't say them.
That would just be silly. I'll go 1 times 10 to the 3rd highlies.
Okay.
I think that's the highest I can possibly do.
Oh no. Let's
anyway,
move on.
But yes, to go back to the actual thing that brought all of this up. It really is the case that many adults, I would say all of the ones I know for the most part, but I don't know every adult on earth, so whatever.
Yeah.
But a large portion of adults, by the time they are 30 or 40, they couldn't tell you one thing that was super important to them in high school and college without pausing to really think about it. They would have to mentally put themselves back and be like, what was I doing? And why did that seem so important? Oh, it was this because I was, and
it's not a question of when you're that age, you're dumb or something. It's just your perspective is so different, and you are still in that high school perspective, trying to set stuff up for yourself as your adult version of yourself, who you don't know yet. Nobody knows yet.
Right.
You haven't been that person yet. So it's just super challenging to, make the decisions from the lens that you have and then just guess, based on not a whole lot, what you're going to want in 10 years. And it's just,
and I'm very glad just now that you took pains to point out that it's not about intelligence. You're absolutely right. I to me, that was so clear I didn't even bother to say it, but I'm glad you said it because it isn't clear. It's not at all that when you're an adult, you're smarter or anything. That's not what I mean at all. It's not what any of us is saying. It's that, just think
your priorities just change.
Well, literally any system, any object, any product or whatever, the more time it has existed, the more it changes. That's how everything is. Nothing stays the same. So if you've been on Earth for 70 years, you've had 70 years of change. And if you've been on Earth for 50 years, you've only had 50 and, for 20 or whatever. And so, yes, it's sort of inevitable that in many, many ways, the person you are decades from now is just going to be a person who has been exposed to decades more stuff. Whatever that does to them, it's going to, change.
Then the world you're living in has changed and all that.
Right. All of it.
So I did want to mention a couple details, more specifically from Shirin's own journey. One little detail that I really loved and thought was just an important, small practical detail was she mentioned when she was, I think, there's so many little shifts in getting a qualification from one place and tutoring somewhere, working. I don't remember the exact details, but there was a point where she was working at a school and she was getting her master's and she described being in walking distance from both. And that's such a simple little, that kind of planning could make a difference. You know what I mean? If you have to if you can avoid a car payment every month, especially in that phase in your life, you can create flexibility for yourself if you just think through if I have this job here and I get a place to live in this little area, that will facilitate, the stuff I'll need to be doing for this point in time. I feel like a lot of people undervalue that kind of strategic thinking Again, especially at that point in your life when you're freshly out of college and you're not really established yet financially, you might not have any sort of money saved up or anything like that. And obviously Shirin didn't. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out as, if you're in that stage of life, don't underestimate kind of just spending a little bit of time thinking on the logistics of, the next couple of steps that you're making.
Yeah. And actually specifically on the point of commuting to work and that kind of thing. I remember reading this study or an article about a study a while ago where some psychologists tried to figure out like what is something that correlates universally to people being happier in like a measurable, like linear, predictable kind of a way. And you would think it would be things like having more money, maybe being healthier, having like better health metrics or whatever. And those things apparently do correlate like to some extent, but like the thing that correlated the most highly, I think this is from memory, so maybe it's not exactly right. I think it was the top thing. Maybe it was like one of the top things was something like for every 5 minutes shorter that your commute was, you were like 15% more likely to say that you were happy.
Wow.
And and this was apparently like it held true like in all cultures, like in all places, at all ages.
One constant,
and I feel like now I must be overstating this, but it was something very, very strong. Like
there are little details like that that really matter, and they're easy to get lost in the shuffle of everything else you're thinking about.
And it's one of those things that's kind of like, in college, I and every one of my friends had at least one semester where we were like, oh, I'll get up for that 7 o'clock in the morning class. Like, I really like it. It's going to be great.
Nope.
You're
dropping it. Yeah. Unless you're the person who just gets up early anyway and you can get going. If that goes against your personality, though, that is going to be
in every single one of our cases, it did not hold for the entire semester.
I don't know a single person.
Yeah. But in the same kind of way, we all think, I shouldn't say all, but I do this. And I think a lot of people do too. I will think that, I can commit to something difficult because in the moment that I'm making the commitment, I'm like, oh yeah.
It's very easy to just.
Of course, I'm always going to feel the way I feel right now. Like, how would I not?
Yeah.
But the commute thing can kind of be like that. You'll be like, well, I can.
Yeah. What's another 10 minutes each day forever? Yeah.
Right. But it starts, if you think about it, like that's a lot of time.
It's lost time. That is your life. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So that was another great little detail, I think, just from little bits of advice that can really make a difference. She described going to that career fair with a friend of hers and just totally feeling like, all right, my friend is the star of the show. I'm just kind of coming along. And when you have that sort of nothing to lose, nothing to gain attitude, you can be much more in the moment, you're not overthinking things. You're not worried about how you come off, and you can have that kind of confidence. And she said that she'll advise kids going to college fairs and that kind of thing, like go talk to somebody where you have no interest, you know what I mean? So it's just kind of practice, get in the groove that you're just having this conversation, sort of break the ice somewhere where you're not too worried about what happens. And, I think a lot of people get intimidated at the thought of talking, laying it all on the line, sort of having a conversation, risking that you're going to make a bad impression or something. And I think that's great advice to just, in a situation like that, go somewhere where it doesn't matter to you, and then that can really get you like warmed up and feeling more comfortable. But I think that's a big phenomenon that a lot of people experience, where you're just too worried and you get in your head. And this is a great way to address that, I thought.
Yeah. I think we've all, again, I'm saying we've all, just because I can think of so many times I did it.
I and all the best people like myself.
I have definitely been in that scenario. I was just wondering, I wonder what it's like to be at the booth where the people are walking up who like clearly are just using you as practice.
You're the warm-up booth. Like, why does this happen every year?
I mean, I'm sure that, whatever. I doubt that actually I doubt that happens so much that one person feels like right. But yeah, it is very good advice. And that's the thing people often say too about doing job interviews. I don't know so much whether this is still good advice because the world has changed significantly and job hopping now is not nearly as big of a red flag as it used to be. In fact, I would say from what I've seen in many fields now, job hopping is actually like a good thing. It shows that you have a skill set that other people want, But when I was coming up, they would advise you to sometimes look for another job anyway and go through the process of like filling out the application, getting your resume together, because that makes you keep your resume current. It makes you kind of keep everything ready to go. And you would be encouraged to go do interviews for jobs, even though you had no desire to actually take the job if it was offered to you, just because it kind of like kept that, and the more
keeps that awareness.
Well, yeah. And the more that you sit and do those kinds of interviews, the less intimidating any future interview is, because you've just done it so many times.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those misconceptions about what gets you ahead in the world. And this has come up in other interviews as well. But I think a lot of people think, well, if I just do my job better than anybody, somebody's going to come find me. And that could happen. But there's definitely a phenomenon where there are people who are doing better professionally in terms of making more money, having the jobs other people want, not necessarily because they're way better than other people, but because they're always thinking of, like, not just thinking, but making sure they're aware of other opportunities and aware that they could, quote unquote, get ahead, try to get a higher ranking job or whatever within their company or with somebody else. They're just taking steps toward that, like exactly what you described, going to those interviews. Whereas a lot of people might be really good at what they do, but they just think, well, I have a job, so whatever, why am I going to try to get another one? Other people might be, have the exact same skill set, but they're also checking listings, a couple times a month just to see what's out there and open to actually changing them and not just settling into routine. And it's not, it could be that that person is also more qualified, but they could have the exact same qualifications and get much better outcomes just because they're looking for those outcomes, and taking steps toward them.
Yeah. I had a mentor once who always made a big deal out of job titles, which for me, from my background and my mindset when I finished college, I was very into the idea that everyone should work hard and do what they do and play their role, even if it was a leadership role, play a role without making a big deal out of it. As our dad used to say that people should do, like after they scored a touchdown, he'd be like, you should act like you've been there before. This isn't your first touchdown. It's not going to be your last, like just run back and, do the next thing you have to do. And that was sort of my mindset for a lot of things. And so I never cared what someone called the job I had, like why you're doing it the same.
How is that relevant?
Yeah. Why would it matter? That's a really dumb way to look at it, by the way. I understand this now.
Because to some people, it really does matter.
Yeah, it matters because certain titles like manager or vice president or lead or assistant or senior, any of those things, like there's no formal legal definition for what makes you a senior VP versus a VP. It's a totally made up thing. Like
within that company.
Right. The company might have its own rules, but those rules are not like, they're not written in the stars.
Universal or...
Yeah, someone made them up.
Yeah.
And they're made up a little bit differently at each company. So, but the thing is, if you are applying for a job and the title of the job is something like senior analyst or some kind of thing like that, if you're coming from a job where your previous job title was junior analyst, that looks not as good as if you're coming from a job where your job title already was senior something.
It's a signal to a prospective new employer about who you are, what you...
Right. And it might be that at one company, what a junior analyst does is exactly the same as what a senior analyst does at another company. Like there's no one-to-one equivalency there, but just in terms of the psychological impact. And so, it was very important to him that every time someone changed jobs, there should be an improvement in the title. Because after like 3 or 4 changes, if you keep angling for these small improvements, suddenly you went from being the junior, whatever, to the lead, or the head or the senior or the president of the thing, or like whatever it is. It's kind of like if you ever see those YouTube videos or read those articles where someone like starts out with a pine cone they found and they like trade it up and up and up and up until they have
you trade all the way up to like a speedboat or something.
Right. Yeah. It's that, but with the words, basically. Anyway, it's just a good example of how the adult world works in certain ways with respect to like job titles and practicing and job searches and career changes and all those kinds of things. Like it's not
stuff that feels silly and frivolous
in a lot of ways. Right? Yeah.
2 other quick, practical real life things that I wanted to point out that I think are really great lessons, and I'll do them quickly. One of them was when Shirin described getting into that program where she still had to find her own job. And so she just cold called a whole bunch of principals, which is like not what you do normally, and the fact that she was just in a time crunch and it had to be that way. And she did it and it worked,
In New York City, of all places, like we have family in New York and they just the state, like not even the city where it's apparently even more competitive to get a teaching job. There is like to get a job anywhere is great, but it's like, it's a life's work almost until
there's so many people trying to get everything. And if Shirin had asked somebody, how do I do this? They would not have said that, but she didn't have a lot of time. That was like kind of a direct approach and she did it and it worked. And that's how it is sometimes. You might feel like, oh, I want to get into this, but I have no idea how to. Look around, see what you can find out. But if you can't find out anything, you could just start doing stuff, as long as you're not like burning bridges or doing something terrible, if you're just reaching out to people. Maybe that's just what you got to do. So I thought that was really cool.
Well, and something else, go on. Sorry, I think with that kind of thing, particularly like cold calling or whatever, I think it's easy in the abstract when you hear about doing it. It's easy to be like, oh yeah, I could do that. Like, that's not that hard. But like, it's on the one hand quite simple, but on the other hand, if you're at all emotionally attached to the outcome of these things.
Well, it's like we talked about earlier, when you care about something.
That's true. Right.
Yeah.
And so, so if you ever would imagine yourself like doing that kind of cold outreach, whether it's by email, phone calls, whatever, you have to be like mentally ready for the idea that you're going to do maybe 20 calls, 50 calls. And most of the time you're not even going to speak to a person.
And each call will be 5 seconds long. Yeah.
Most of the people you speak to are going to be like, oh, geez, no, sorry. I've already got like, whatever, like leave me alone. And all of that, you're putting all of that in because if there is, in this particular case, if there is the one person who eventually goes, oh yeah, I have a job for you, then suddenly it was all worth it. But in the moment of going through all of that rejection, you don't know that there's going to be a payoff.
Yeah.
Right. So, just wanted to point that out. Like, it's easy to say, oh yeah, anybody could cold call if they had to, but it really takes a certain amount of initiative and commitment. And that's a thing too, that, really just, obviously I think it's clear that I have a pretty high opinion of Shirin. One of the things about her that I've always found really inspiring is that she is like so motivated to, you remember she was saying when she was talking about like the thing that led her to even apply for this program was her friend saying, this program is harder, but it's better. Like that was the phrase, harder, but better. And think to yourself, like, what was it that made it better? It wasn't like the perks or any kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
It was better
lifestyle
because
or whatever.
Yeah. Ultimately you were hopefully going to be able to help some kids. Like that was the thing that made it better. And for a lot of people, that wouldn't be, not just kids, but to help another human being with your career time. Like that wouldn't be the thing that everybody goes, oh yeah, that's better,
Yeah. Ooh, I'd like some of that. Yeah.
Right. And it was such a strong feeling for her, such a strong drive that she didn't just say, oh, that would be better. But, I don't really have the time. She said, okay, that would be better. I want to do that. I'm going to uproot my entire life. I'm going to cold call principals in New York City and hope that somebody eventually gets all of this so that I can eventually, she didn't know that at the time, but eventually I'm going to like show up to the KIPP campus at like 3:30 in the morning or whatever time it is to be like ready for the, and I'm going to devote my whole life to following, all this stuff. Yeah. And that also, in a way, speaks to the drive that so many career educators have. Like you have to be that hungry for that level of public service in order to make it, to go for so long and to thrive and to all that stuff. It's very impressive, I think.
Agreed. I was going to say too, with the principal thing, it reminds me of our first interview with Alex B. Alec, who described being a waitress and being working at a call center doing telemarketing, and how for her, she just said, it just gives you a thick skin. You call 50 people and a lot of them hang up on you and it's fine. There's another person to call, and it's a cool sort of training for other stuff.
And I bet in that job, the hang up is actually probably a pretty good outcome. Like some of the abuse that you probably take if they stay on the phone.
That's exactly.
It's pretty awful, I'm sure.
So that was the one thing. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was when she described touring that school where the job she wanted wasn't even open, just to do it, and you think, it's an afternoon, you go and, connect with these people, they can see your face, you can talk to them. And then she said, if this ever becomes available, like I'm very interested. And then this, the person who held the position ended up going to grad school unexpectedly, and then it all worked out, and obviously it might not have worked out, but that's a great mindset to think, well, how long does it take to just check this place out? Right now there's nothing there for me. Let me just, meet someone face to face And obviously there's a good outcome. So that's like a great, very similar to the cold call thing. You don't know that it's going to pay off, but what's it going to hurt you to give it a shot? So I think we could clearly both go on for a while about all this stuff. I think we've covered all the major bases. Do you have any burning desire to add any particular thing at the moment, or you think you're...
Nope. Got it. That's it.
Yeah, we have extracted all the value out of that conversation.
Yeah. No, not even close, but...
No, I know. Yeah, we
Right.
haven't. But I think we've hit all the major things.
Yeah. Oh, the crying stepdad. Oh, man.
I know. I mean, that's
That really...
some real stuff.
So thank you very much to Shirin for giving so generously of
tons of insight, tons of real world experience on display there. That was very, very useful. So yeah, that's all for now. If you like the show, please take a moment to rate and review us on iTunes or the podcast player of your choice. And of course, if you want to hear more episodes, remember to subscribe as well. You can find our SAT Prep Black Book and ACT Prep Black Book on Amazon.com, and you can find our online video courses on QuestPrep.com. Please tune in for our next episode coming up in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, feel free to reach out to us on our Quest Prep Facebook page or the Quest Prep YouTube channel. This episode was hosted by my brother, Mike Barrett, and, more importantly, by myself, Patrick Barrett. Our guest was Shirin Foroudi. Every musical element was created and performed by Parker Hale Hastings. There are more hydrogen atoms in a teaspoon of water than there are teaspoons of water on Earth.
So here's that segment we promised you on the optional essays for the SAT and the ACT. Let's start with a little background so you can understand the situation. For most of its history, the SAT didn't even include an essay, and neither did the ACT. Then, in 2005, the College Board first added an essay section to the SAT, basically because educational leaders said they wanted the SAT to test writing ability more directly, and the ACT followed suit. But colleges quickly realized that the 2005 version of the SAT essay was a terrible test of actual writing ability. Here's a direct quote on the topic from Dr. Les Perlman, who was the director of undergraduate writing at MIT at the time. He said that the SAT essay rewarded, quote, exactly what we don't want to teach our kids, end quote. And similar problems plagued the ACT essay. Without getting into too many details here, the basic issue was that if a test taker just wrote a very long essay that was mostly coherent, then they could be pretty much guaranteed to get a high score on those essays. The grading process was basically designed from the beginning to ignore things like grammatical errors, weird diction, incorrect facts, faulty logic, and stuff like that. Stuff that's generally considered to be essential to good academic writing did not factor in those essay tests. So, back in 2005, it didn't take too long for lots of colleges to just announce that they weren't going to consider the essay portions of the SAT and the ACT in the application process, even though those essays had been added to those tests to satisfy the demands of some colleges and universities in the first place. So then, in 2015, both the SAT and the ACT updated their essay tests. To their credit, both companies tried to fix some of the more obvious issues in the 2005 versions of those essay tests by doing things like giving you sample evidence or opinions to work with and analyze in your response. There's still a very formulaic way to crank out an essay that's pretty much guaranteed to score high on the current versions of those essay tests, but it does require a little more effort than just writing a lot. Although it's still true that more essay length correlates very highly with a better score, and short essays never score high, no matter how well written they are otherwise. For the current essay tests, we recommend you follow some small formulaic steps to handle the provided material that now comes along with the essay prompts. But it's still true that the current essay tests will allow you to get away with some bad grammar, faulty reasoning, and factual inaccuracy because the grading system still doesn't pay attention to that stuff. And by the way, if you're familiar with the published scoring guides for those essays, you might be thinking, hey, wait a second, Mike. The scoring guides for both of those essay tests clearly state that things like grammar and factual accuracy are taken into account. And you're right, the guides do say that. But when you look at the essays that actually score high, you see that they don't necessarily actually demonstrate all of the elements mentioned in the scoring guidelines. And it's also true that lots of low-scoring essays do incorporate elements that should get them higher scores according to the published scoring guides. So this ends up being just another example of how the ACT and the SAT claim to be testing one set of skills, but most of the time they actually reward something else. Anyway, it's not even really worth discussing all the steps that you should take to do well on these optional essay tests because, first of all, I've already been talking about this for a long time. And secondly, these optional essay tests are still seen as very bad tests of writing ability by pretty much everybody in the college admissions process. In fact, they're so bad that lots of schools, including all Ivy League schools and most other top-ranked colleges and universities, don't even ask you to take the optional essay portion of the SAT or the ACT at all. But here's a key thing most people overlook. Even when schools do require you to submit essay scores, those schools don't report the essay scores that you submit along with other testing stats in their admissions data. In other words, when you look up the target scores on the SAT or the ACT for schools that do require you to submit an essay score, those schools still don't bother to report a target essay score. They just tell you the target scores on the multiple choice portions of the tests. Or when you look up a profile of a school's incoming freshman class, the school might report the range of SAT or ACT scores in the middle 50% of their class, for example. That's very common, but they never report the essay scores, even when they require you to submit those essay scores. The reason for this is probably that those schools disregard the essay test scores just like everybody else does. Of course, if that's the case, you might then ask why they require you to submit the essay scores in the first place if they're just going to ignore them. My guess is that those schools just don't want it to look like they don't care about writing ability. So if there's an optional test out there that claims to measure writing ability, then they want to make sure that they require it. That just sort of gives the right impression to the public, I think. Anyway, all of this boils down to the following piece of advice. Make a list of the target schools that you plan to apply to and check the admissions requirements of each school to find out whether you're required to take the essay portion of the SAT or the ACT when you're applying to that school. If none of your target schools require you to submit the optional essay test score, then, of course, don't bother taking the essay portion of the ACT or the SAT. There's literally no value to taking it in that scenario. You aren't going to impress an admissions officer with a high score on these optional essay tests because everybody knows that the essay tests are bad at measuring writing ability, and your application has plenty of other ways for you to demonstrate writing ability anyway. So spend your precious time and energy on the other parts of the test you're taking, the multiple choice parts of that test. Those are the parts that have a direct impact on your chance of getting into a school or getting financial aid. Now, on the other hand, if you find out that one of your target schools does officially require you to submit an essay score with your SAT or ACT, then you will need to take the essay portion of the test in order to apply, of course. But it's important to remember that the optional essay is almost certainly a formality in every case. You shouldn't spend your time and energy preparing for the optional essay section in the way that you might prepare for a big essay test in a high school or a college class because, first of all, those essays aren't designed or graded in a way that's anything similar to how a high school or college essay is graded. And secondly, it's almost a guarantee that your essay score on the SAT or the ACT won't be the deciding factor in your application. So again, you should focus on improving your scores on the multiple choice parts of those tests because that is what will definitely have a noticeable impact on your admissions chances and your financial aid chances. So let me say this again. Don't spend any time preparing for the essay section, even if a school requires you to submit an essay score, until you're happy with your performance on every other part of the test, because the multiple choice parts of the ACT and the SAT will actually impact your chances for admissions and scholarships, while your essay scores on those tests are practically guaranteed not to matter to anybody, even the schools that make you go through the process of submitting them. In short, if those optional essay scores mattered to those schools, then we would expect schools to track them and report them with the rest of their testing data, which they don't do. Now, please don't get me wrong with what I'm saying here. I am not saying that schools shouldn't care about writing ability or that writing is not an important part of education or anything silly like that. Writing is an extremely important thing to care about, and it's a crucial part of education. That is not the issue. The issue is just that the optional essays on the SAT and the ACT don't do a good job of testing writing ability under realistic conditions, and pretty much everybody knows it. Now, of course, our black books and video courses for the ACT and the SAT do still give a full detailed explanation of how to do well on those optional essay tests, including detailed analyses of what really succeeds and what really fails on actual example essays graded by the real test makers. So if you're still interested in scoring high on those optional essays, just so you can, I don't know, tell your grandkids about it someday or something like that, then we've got you covered. We just don't recommend focusing on the essays until you're happy with your performance on the rest of the test, because again, the multiple choice portion of the test is what can actually affect your results when it comes to admissions and financial aid. So I hope this segment provided some insight into the SAT essay and the ACT essay, and I hope it helps you to focus your time and energy where they'll do you the most good. For more on our books and video courses, please head over to questprep.com or search for the SAT Prep Black Book and the ACT Prep Black Book on Amazon.com.